Tonight you are about to step into a forgotten world long before civilization where every night could be your last. Above you unfamiliar stars burn over a landscape untouched by roads, cities, borders, or written names. Somewhere beyond the firelight another kind of human may be walking through the darkness. They are not quite your people yet, they are not entirely strangers either. Their faces are different, their bodies shaped by another history, and their ancestors separated from yours thousands of generations earlier. But here is the strange part. They never completely disappeared. Tiny pieces of them survived hidden inside human DNA, carried silently through families for tens of thousands of years. Some came from Neanderthals, others came from Denisovans, still others may belong to populations whose bones have never been confidently identified. So how many vanished humans are quietly travelling inside you tonight? Before we step deeper into the darkness of tonight's story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe for more calming historical journeys. And while you settle in, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what your local time is right now. Now dim the lights and imagine that the room around you begins to disappear. The soft walls fade first, followed by the familiar hum of electricity and distant traffic. In their place comes the whisper of dry grass bending beneath a cold prehistoric wind. You stand beneath an enormous open sky. The air smells faintly of spoke-damp earth and animal hide warmed beside a small fire. Somewhere nearby, wood cracks softly as sparks drift upward into darkness. You are surrounded by humans. At least they appear human at first glance. Someone crouches near the flames, turning a piece of wood slowly between strong weathered hands. Another figure sits farther away, repairing a stone tool with careful taps that echo into the night. Yet their faces would probably make you stare. Their brows are heavier than yours, their bodies stockier, and their movements seem perfectly adapted to this difficult landscape. These are not monsters from some forgotten evolutionary experiment. They are Neanderthals. For much of the 20th century popular culture imagined Neanderthals as crude creatures stumbling toward extinction. The picture was convenient, simple, and wonderfully flattering to modern humans. We were clever. They were not. History unfortunately enjoys ruining comfortable stories. Archaeologists gradually uncovered evidence of sophisticated stone technology, controlled fire-organized hunting, and repeated occupation of carefully chosen landscapes. Some Neanderthal communities appear to have cared for injured individuals who could not easily survive alone. You hear quiet movement behind you. A child has awakened beneath a covering of animal skin. An older adult reaches down and gently adjusts the hide before returning attention to the fire. It is an ordinary gesture, almost too small to matter. Yet such moments change how you imagine the past. These people had families. They remembered. They learned. They worried. And eventually some of their descendants met yours. That meeting is the reason tonight's journey can begin inside your own body. Most living people with substantial ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal-derived DNA, although the amount differs between individuals and populations. 1 or 2% sounds tiny, but genetics plays tricks with intuition. You do not simply possess one neat block labeled Neanderthal, tucked politely into a chromosome. Instead, ancient fragments are scattered throughout the genomes of living populations. Different people carry different fragments. Taken together, humanity preserves far more Neanderthal genetic material than any single person contains. It's rather like discovering that a destroyed library survives because thousands of travelers each carried away several different pages. No traveler owns the entire book. Together they preserve much of it. The idea would have sounded almost impossible only a few decades ago. For generations, fossils provided the main evidence for vanished human populations. A skull could reveal shape. Teeth might suggest diet. Bones could hint at movement, growth, injury, or age. But bones rarely tell you who had children with whom. DNA can. Ancient genetics transformed the human family tree into something much stranger than researchers once expected. Instead of clean branches separating forever, populations repeatedly split, migrated, encountered one another, and sometimes mixed again. The family tree became a network. A slightly awkward family reunion, perhaps. And Neanderthals are only the beginning. Later in your journey, you will enter a Siberian cave where a fragment of finger bone helped reveal another ancient population. The Denisovans were identified largely through genetics before scientists possessed anything resembling a complete Denisovan skeleton. Their discovery showed that entire human populations might remain almost invisible archaeologically. That possibility still unhurls researchers. How many groups came and went without leaving recognizable fossils? How many left only DNA? Some genetic studies have suggested traces of deeply separated ancestry that could represent unknown ancient populations, sometimes casually described as ghost populations. The term sounds supernatural. It is not. A genetic ghost is simply a population inferred through patterns of inheritance rather than clearly matched archaeological remains. You cannot photograph them. You may not know their faces, yet statistical echoes can suggest that they existed. Imagine standing beside a river and finding footprints entering the water from one bank. You never see the traveler, but the marks tell you someone passed through. Ancient genomes can leave similar footprints. Researchers compare patterns of genetic variation between populations and look for sections that seem unusually old or unexpectedly different. Certain patterns may indicate that ancestors once exchanged genes with another population. Still, interpretation is difficult. Researchers continue debating how confidently some proposed ghost lineages can be distinguished from complicated population structure within early Homo sapiens groups. A strange genetic signal does not automatically prove an unknown species existed. Human populations have always moved, divided, reunited, and changed size. Those processes alone can create patterns that resemble ancient interbreeding. The mystery survives because the evidence is subtle. That uncertainty makes the story more interesting, not less. Science rarely moves through dramatic revelations followed by permanent certainty. More often it moves through careful disagreements, better methods, newly discovered samples, and conclusions that slowly become clearer. You notice the prehistoric fire burning lower now. Its smell clings lightly to your imagined clothing. Cold air brushes your face. Beyond the camp, darkness stretches across the valley, and another human group might be sleeping somewhere beyond those hills. Perhaps they look unfamiliar. Perhaps their language sounds completely different. Perhaps nobody around this fire would think of them as family. Yet thousands of generations later, the distinction may become strangely difficult to maintain. One curious detail illustrates just how tangled these encounters became. Scientists have identified an ancient individual whose mother was Neanderthal and whose father was Denisovan. She was not merely someone possessing distant ancestry from two populations. Her parents came directly from those two groups. That discovery suggests encounters between archaic humans were not always rare events separated by enormous stretches of time. Sometimes the meeting was personal. Two people met, a child was born, and tens of thousands of years later scientists found part of her remains inside a cave. It feels almost intrusive. You are peering into a family story older than agriculture, older than cities, and older than every surviving human language. Yet that story is also part of a larger truth. Human evolution was never a lonely march toward the present. Different human populations shared landscapes for extraordinary spans of time. They sometimes competed for resources, probably avoided one another at times, and occasionally exchanged knowledge or genes. The exact nature of those relationships remains uncertain. Historians and scientists still argue over how often peaceful contact occurred, compared with rivalry avoidance or simple coexistence across neighboring territories. The evidence cannot record every conversation. Stone tools cannot preserve a greeting. DNA cannot tell you whether two people trusted each other. Still, something endured. You carry the result forward. Every breath you take tonight belongs to a body assembled from a very long history of survival, migration, adaptation, chance meetings, and forgotten families. The ghost humans are not hiding inside you like separate personalities. They are fragments of inheritance, small molecular messages. Most have no obvious effect that you could ever notice. Others have been connected with traits involving immunity, skin metabolism, sleep, or adaptation to particular environments. Some associations are strong, others remain debated. Evolution rarely gives simple gifts. A variant useful in one prehistoric environment might become neutral somewhere else. Another may carry both advantages and disadvantages depending upon circumstances. Your genome is not a perfectly designed machine. It is an old workshop. Parts have been replaced, reused, modified, and occasionally kept long after their original purpose disappeared. And somewhere among those parts are traces of people who watched other stars follow different paths and once believed tomorrow belonged to them. The fire settles into red embers. The valley grows quieter. You listen to the soft breathing of sleeping figures around you while the cold deepens beyond the shelter. Before you can understand the ghosts within your DNA, however, you must travel farther backward. You must return to a time when humanity was not one surviving family. It was many, and the world was crowded with cousins. Section 2. You leave the dying embers behind and move farther into the past, beyond the camp, beyond the valley, beyond even the familiar shape of humanity you know today. The landscape changes slowly around you. Forests expand, shrink, and return. Grasslands roll across regions that will later become farm cities and borders. Great rivers change course while glaciers advance and retreat with patient force. You are entering the Pleistocene. For nearly 3 million years, this long geological age repeatedly reshaped the world through colder and warmer cycles. Sea levels rose and fell, deserts expanded then softened, habitats shifted across continents. Humans shifted with them. That word humans is already becoming complicated. You may have grown up imagining evolution as a neat staircase. One creature becomes another, which becomes another, until Homo sapiens finally appears at the top. It is an appealing picture. It is also misleading. The deeper you travel, the more the staircase dissolves into branching paths. Several human forms exist at the same time. I begin to see a crowded family in Africa, Eurasia, and parts of Southeast Asia. Different human populations live in landscapes separated by mountains, deserts, rivers, and enormous distances. Some are tall and long-limbed, others are compact and powerfully built. Each group knows its own world. No one understands that they are participating in what future scientists will call human evolution. They simply wake hungry, they watch weather, they follow animals, they search for water. You hear stone striking stone in the distance. The sound is sharp, dry, and strangely comforting. A group sits near an exposed outcrop selecting workable rock. Their fingers know which angles matter. A poorly aimed strike wastes material while a careful blow releases a useful cutting edge. This is skill learned through repetition. Researchers still debate how much formal instruction existed in different ancient human groups because stone tools preserve technique but rarely preserve the social process behind it. You watch an older individual reposition a younger hand. The gesture is imagined yet plausible. Long before writing survival depends on memory travelling from one mind into another. By the middle Pleistocene, more than one human lineage occupied the Old World, and these populations did not form a single uniform species spread evenly across continents. But naming them is difficult. Fossils refuse to organize themselves politely. A skull may combine features associated with several groups. A jaw may look primitive in one respect and surprisingly recent in another. Taxonomy becomes messy. Scientists love labels, bones seem less enthusiastic. Names such as Homo heidelbergensis, Homo antecessor, Neanderthal Denisovan, and early Homo sapiens help researchers discuss patterns, but the boundaries between some groups remain contested. You wander through this uncertainty beneath a pale morning sky. The air stings your nose. Wet leaves release an earthy smell beneath your feet while distant birds call from a riverbank. Somewhere in this broad world populations are separating. Elsewhere they are meeting again. Imagine two groups divided by climate for thousands of years. One remains in a forested region while another follows open grasslands farther east. Their bodies and genes slowly diverge. Then the climate changes. The barrier weakens. Their descendants encounter each other again. What happens next may not be replacement. It may be mixture. This repeated splitting and reconnecting is one reason human evolution increasingly looks less like a tree and more like braided streams. The streams separate, then sometimes they cross. A curious reminder comes from Southeast Asia. On floras a small-bodied human called Homo floresiensis survived until relatively recent prehistory. In the Philippines, fossils have been assigned to another unusual form, Homo luzonensis. Neither is known to have contributed DNA to living humans. Their existence still matters. The world your ancestors entered was not empty, nor was Homo sapiens obviously destined to dominate it. You walk along a muddy shoreline and notice footprints pressed into damp sediment. Some belong to children. The smaller tracks wander slightly as children's tracks often do. Prehistoric life was dangerous, yet danger did not erase curiosity, play, affection, or impatience. Someone probably still had to call the wandering child back. The farther you look, the less these ancient populations resemble faceless evolutionary experiments. They become communities shaped by routine. Food must be shared, tools must be repaired, children must be watched, fire must be maintained. Different environments reward different solutions. That diversity may have encouraged different bodies, technologies, and traditions to emerge. Yet scholars still disagree about how sharply cultural differences mapped onto biological populations. A particular stone tool style does not necessarily belong to one human species. Ideas can spread without genes, and similar problems can inspire similar solutions independently. The stone itself cannot introduce its maker. Steel patterns accumulate. By several 100,000 years ago, ancestors of Neanderthals were developing in Western Eurasia. Denisovan-related populations were established somewhere across Asia, though their exact range remains frustratingly unclear. Meanwhile, early Homo sapiens populations were emerging in Africa. Not from one tiny isolated birthplace perhaps, Many researchers now consider the possibility that our species formed through interactions among several African populations connected over long periods. Africa itself may have contained deep population structure. Your earliest ancestors may already have belonged to partially separated communities, occasionally exchanging genes across large distances. Before Homo sapiens met Neanderthals, our own lineage may already have been complicated. That matters because genetics can preserve old divisions inside populations. Some signals interpreted as evidence of unknown archaic humans may instead reflect very ancient structure within Homo sapiens ancestors. Researchers continue testing both possibilities. The ghosts are difficult to identify. Even when they leave genetic footprints, you must decide whose footprints they are. You pass beside a river in the afternoon. Water slides over dark stones, cold and clear. The current produces a steady sound that almost hides movement in the reeds. Across the river stands another group. You cannot tell who they are. Perhaps their ancestors separated from yours thousands of generations ago. Perhaps they are close relatives. Perhaps the distinction would mean nothing to either side. You simply see people watching people. No flags divide you, no maps explain ancestry. There is only distance. Maybe caution, maybe curiosity. Over immense spans of time, scenes like this probably happened again and again. Some encounters ended quickly. Some led to shared territory. Some may have produced children. Those children carried ancestry from both sides, turning a clean evolutionary branch into something tangled. Once different human populations can meet and reproduce, disappearance no longer always means extinction in the simplest sense. A population can vanish as a distinct group while some of its genes continue onward inside another. Its language may disappear. Its tools may disappear. Its face may disappear from the landscape. Yet fragments remain. You feel the evening cold returning now. Smoke from another distant fire drifts across the plain, thin and almost sweet. Somewhere beyond the low hills, another lineage is living through an ordinary night. They do not know you. You do not know them. But one day their descendants may meet yours. And when that happens, the human family will become even harder to untangle. Section 3. The distant fire beyond the hills fades behind you as the landscape begins another slow transformation. You are still moving through deep prehistory, but now the travelers around you look increasingly familiar. Their faces vary, their bodies differ from one region to another, their tools carry traditions shaped by generations of practice. Yet these people belong to the broad lineage that will eventually include you. Homo sapiens has appeared in Africa. The story does not begin with one heroic family standing at a border, deciding to conquer the world. There is no prehistoric departure gate, no solemn speech, and thankfully no luggage allowance. Instead, movement happens gradually. Families follow water. Hunters track animals. Communities shift when rainfall changes, when familiar plants disappear, or when neighboring groups move into new territory. Over thousands of years, small journeys accumulate into enormous migrations. You walk beside one such group in the cool light before sunrise. Fine dust presses beneath your feet. A leather bundle rubs softly against someone's shoulder as they carry stoneflakes, food, and whatever else cannot be easily replaced. The morning air smells of dry grass and yesterday's smoke. Ahead lies uncertainty. Behind you lies Africa, though even that phrase is far too simple. Africa is vast. Its landscapes include forests, open savannas, mountains, wetlands, coastlines, and enormous dry regions that expand and contract with climate. Early Homo sapiens populations did not live inside a single uniform environment. They were already adapting to many different worlds. Some groups lived near coasts and gathered shellfish. Others hunted inland animals or collected plants from seasonal grasslands. The continent was never one ecological stage. It was many. Then climate opened new possibilities. At different times during the Pleistocene wetter periods transformed regions that later became severe deserts. Rivers flowed where sand would eventually dominate, and lakes appeared across landscapes now associated with dryness. These greener intervals could create corridors northward. Humans followed them. You'll begin to hear insects buzzing above patches of standing water. Mud clings to your ankles. The air feels warmer here, heavy with moisture, and reeds sway beside a shallow lake. This does not resemble the desert you expected. That is the point. The Sahara has repeatedly changed. During humid periods, areas now covered by dunes supported lakes, grasslands, grazing animals, and human communities. One surprisingly charming clue comes from later prehistoric rock art showing swimmers in a region that is now extremely arid. Those images belong to a much later period than the first Homo sapiens dispersals, but they remind you how dramatically North Africa could change. The desert was not always a wall. Sometimes it became a bridge. Modern humans appear outside Africa surprisingly early. Fossils associated with Homo sapiens have been found in the eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia from periods far earlier than the major expansion that eventually produced most living non-African ancestry. This means departure happened more than once. Some early movements may have ended without leaving much genetic ancestry in people alive today. Others probably retreated, disappeared, or became absorbed into local populations. The path outward was uneven. You stand near a rocky shelter as evening approaches. A breeze carries the smell of crushed herbs and damp limestone. Stone flakes lie scattered near an old hearth while animal bones rest in the dust. Who made them? That question becomes increasingly difficult. Different human populations may occupy the same region thousands of years apart. Their tools can sometimes resemble each other, while environmental changes repeatedly reshape where people can survive. Archaeologists must reconstruct entire lives from fragments. A tooth, a hearth, a broken point, a thin layer of ash beneath another thin layer of ash. You begin to appreciate how fragile certainty becomes at this depth of time. Still, one fact is clear. Homo sapiens was not entering an empty Eurasia. Neanderthals had already lived across broad parts of Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Farther east, archaic populations occupied territories that remain harder to map. Some were related to Denisovans. Others may have belonged to lineages still poorly understood. You are arriving late. Imagine crossing into a valley where generations of another human population have already learned every seasonal rhythm. They know where deer move during winter. They know which caves remain dry. They know where stone of the best quality can be collected. You do not. From their perspective, you are the newcomer. That changes the emotional texture of the story. Modern humans often imagine themselves as inevitable owners of the landscape. But for these first arrivals, every unfamiliar valley carried risk. You hear wolves somewhere beyond the trees. A child presses closer to an adult. The temperature drops quickly after sunset and smoke from the fire stays low beneath heavy air. You have entered someone else's world. Did the first encounters happen cautiously? Perhaps. Did groups exchange objects, observe one another from a distance, or occasionally share information? Possibly. The archaeological record cannot preserve a nervous glance across a riverbank. Yet genetics eventually reveals that contact became intimate enough for children to be born. That did not necessarily happen immediately. There may have been long periods when groups rarely interacted. Human populations can occupy nearby landscapes and still maintain social boundaries. Language differences matter. Customs matter. Fear matters. So does simple geography. A mountain range can separate people more effectively than hostility ever could. Researchers continue debating exactly when the most important episodes of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals occurred. Genetic evidence strongly suggests that ancestors of most people outside Africa mixed with Neanderthals after leaving Africa, probably somewhere in Western Asia. But there may have been several episodes. Some genetic signals point toward earlier contacts as well. This means the story is not one meeting. It is a sequence of meetings. You follow one imagined band through a narrow passage between dry hills. Wind moves through thorny shrubs with a faint scratching sound. Your lips feel cracked and the smell of dust seems permanently lodged inside your nose. Water becomes the central concern. Every decision bends toward it. A spring can shape a route. A revolver can determine where children survive. A coastline can become a highway. One proposed migration route follows southern Arabia and coastal regions farther east. Another emphasizes movement through the Levant. Both may have mattered during different periods. There is no reason to expect one road. Humans rarely behave that neatly. Even today, people move in many directions for many reasons. Prehistory was probably no different, except nobody left customs records behind. As generations pass, the travelers change. Not dramatically in appearance, but culturally and genetically. A family born far from Africa grows up considering this new place normal. Their children inherit stories about valleys their grandparents crossed. Eventually, Africa is no longer a lived memory. It becomes deep ancestry. You move farther north. Trees become more common. Winters grow colder. Animal hides are wrapped more tightly around shoulders and fires become increasingly important after sunset. The people beside you are learning. They experiment with unfamiliar prey. They discover new stone sources. They adapt old knowledge to new conditions. And somewhere beyond the next ridge, another human community may already be watching. Perhaps the smoke from your fire has been noticed. Perhaps strange footprints have been found near a stream. Perhaps someone has picked up a stone tool and recognized that unfamiliar hands shaped it. You feel the tension softly. Not battle. Not yet. Just awareness. For the first time in generations, two human histories are moving toward the same landscape. Neither side knows what will follow. There will be avoidance. There will be competition. There may be curiosity, and eventually there will be descendants. The cold air settles around your shoulders as night deepens. Beyond the firelight, Eurasia stretches into darkness, already inhabited, already remembered, already claimed through experience. You are not entering wilderness. You are entering another humanity's home. Section 4. You follow that faint sense of awareness across the dark Eurasian landscape where another human presence now becomes impossible to ignore. The footprints are different. The tools are familiar enough to understand, yet their makers seem to belong to another tradition. Their movements are careful, efficient, and shaped by generations spent surviving cold landscapes you have only recently entered. Then through the grey morning mist you see them. Neanderthals. For a long time they were portrayed as little more than evolutionary failures. Popular drawings gave them hunched backs, vacant expressions, and the general appearance of someone deeply disappointed by breakfast. That image has not aged well. You stand among open woodland beneath a pale winter sky. Frost clings to low branches and your breath forms clouds that vanish almost immediately. The ground smells of wet leaves, smoke, and cold soil. Across a clearing, several figures move around a fire. They are shorter and more powerfully built than many modern humans. Their chests are broad, their limbs relatively compact, and their bodies seem almost designed to conserve heat. Their skulls are distinctive too. You notice strong brow ridges, large noses, and long, low cranial shapes. None of this makes them crude. It simply makes them different. Neanderthals evolved across Europe and Western Asia over hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to environmental conditions that repeatedly shifted between colder and milder phases. They were not frozen permanently inside one endless ice age. Forests sometimes returned. Grasslands expanded. Temperatures fluctuated. Neanderthal communities adjusted again and again. You watch one individual kneeling beside a stone core. A hammerstone strikes with a controlled click. Another flake separates. The work requires planning. Neanderthal toolmaking included sophisticated methods for preparing stone cores so that flakes of useful shapes could be removed deliberately. This was not random and smashing. The maker understands sequence. They imagine an outcome before the final strike arrives. You hear the repeated tapping nearby, steady enough to become almost hypnotic. Stone dust collects on rough fingers. The smell of wood smoke drifts between the trees. A child watches from several steps away. Perhaps that child is learning. Perhaps not today. Archaeology rarely tells you exactly how knowledge moved between generations, but someone had to teach someone eventually. Neanderthal survival depended upon accumulated experience. They understood animals, plants, landscapes, stone, fire, weather, and shelter. Their hunting ability was especially important. Large animals could provide enormous amounts of food, but approaching them carried obvious risks. Neanderthals appear to have hunted deer, horses, wild cattle, and other game depending upon region and period. Some hunting methods may have required close cooperation. Wooden spears and stone-tipped weapons placed hunters within dangerous distances of large animals. That takes courage. It also takes trust. You move through a narrow valley with several hunters. Snow crunches softly beneath their feet. Nobody speaks loudly. Wind slides along the rock walls carrying the musky smell of animals somewhere ahead. A hand rises. Everyone stops. The group waits. That quiet coordination matters more than brute strength ever could. Older stereotypes imagine Neanderthals surviving mainly through force. Yet effective hunting demands memory, planning, communication, and an understanding of animal behavior. Muscles help. Knowing when not to move helps more. Their lives were not only about hunting. At some sites, evidence suggests Neanderthals processed plants gathered, shellfish collected nuts, and used whatever resources local environments offered. Some may have exploited coastal habitats. Others occupied caves and rock shelters. Still others moved through open landscapes. There was no single Neanderthal lifestyle. That fact is easy to forget. They existed across enormous regions for very long periods. A Neanderthal living near the Mediterranean did not experience the same world as one surviving farther north during a cold phase. You step inside a limestone shelter as REM begins outside. Water taps gently against the entrance. The air smells mineral and damp, while an old hearth gives off a faint smoky scent embedded deeply into the cave floor. Several layers of occupation lie beneath your feet. Different families may have returned here over centuries. Perhaps they knew this place by a name. Of course, no name survives. That absence makes deep prehistory feel strangely quiet. Neanderthals left no writing and no recorded voices. Yet their bones sometimes preserve something unexpectedly intimate. Some individuals survive serious injuries or disabling conditions long enough to suggest that others supported them. One famous example is Shanidarwan, a Neanderthal from what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. He lived with significant injuries and impairments for years. I did not survive alone. Someone tolerated his slower pace. Someone probably shared food. Someone remained nearby. You can almost feel the social meaning inside that fact. A society does not need written moral philosophy to practice care. There is also evidence that Neanderthals sometimes used pigments and collected unusual objects. At several sites, eagle talons appear to have been deliberately modified, possibly as ornaments. Imagine that for a moment. A Neanderthal notices a claw not simply as animal anatomy, but as something worth shaping, carrying, or displaying. It is a wonderfully small detail. Perhaps it meant status. Perhaps beauty. Perhaps nothing you would immediately understand. Scholars continue debating the extent and meaning of Neanderthal symbolic behavior. Pigments, perforated shells, feathers, markings, and unusual objects have all entered that discussion. Some finds look persuasive. Others remain controversial. The larger point is simpler. Their minds were not empty. You sit near the shelter entrance as the evening arrives. Someone adds wood to the fire. The flames brighten, reflecting against uneven stone. A heat brushes your arm, coarse and slightly greasy from use. The warmth feels temporary. Outside temperature falls quickly. You wonder what their voices sounded like. Neanderthal anatomy suggests they possessed many physical requirements for speech, and genetic evidence includes a version of the FOXP2 gene associated with speech and language in modern humans. That does not tell you their vocabulary. It does not reveal grammar. It certainly does not preserve jokes. Still, complex communication seems increasingly plausible. Maybe one person describes a hunting route. Maybe someone complains about the smoke. Some things are probably timeless. Their family groups were likely small. Genetic studies from several sites suggest close biological relationships within local communities, sometimes revealing parents, children, and other relatives. That intimacy could strengthen cooperation. It could also make populations vulnerable. Small groups are fragile. A few deaths, failed births, harsh winters, or disrupted connections with neighboring communities can have serious consequences. I begin to understand why later encounters with Homo sapiens were not simply clashes between two armies. They were meetings between small human communities. A handful of people might encounter another handful. The relationship could vary every time. Sometimes distance may have been safest. Sometimes resources may have brought tension. Sometimes curiosity could have overcome caution. And sometimes, as the DNA inside living humans eventually proves the boundary became intimate, you look across the fire. A Neanderthal face turns toward you. The eyes are alert. The expression is unreadable, yet not alien. That may be the strangest feeling of all. You expected to meet another species. Instead, you meet another version of humanity. Their bodies carry a separate history, but their routines feel recognizable. They protect children. They maintain fires. They shape tools. They recover from injury. They move through landscapes filled with memory. Soon your ancestors will begin meeting them more often, and those encounters will leave something far more durable than footprints in frozen soil. They will leave pieces of themselves inside you. Section 5. The Neanderthal face across the fire slowly fades into darkness, but the meeting does not end there. Something far more durable begins. Not a treaty, not a monument, not even a story anyone remembers telling. A child is born. Then another, perhaps generations later, somewhere else entirely. Across Western Asia and nearby regions. Homo sapiens and Neanderthal populations occasionally met closely enough to have children together. Those children survived, grew older, and passed parts of both ancestries into later generations. You can still carry those fragments now. The idea feels almost impossibly intimate. You are sitting thousands of centuries away from those encounters, yet a portion of their biological consequences may still be present inside your cells. Outside, the imagined shelter wind drags dry leaves across stone. The sound is soft and irregular. Smoke clings to your hair while the air carries the faint smell of hide dust and old ash. Somewhere nearby, two human populations are no longer completely separate. Genetics revealed this more clearly than bones ever could. When scientists successfully reconstructed the Neanderthal genome, they compared ancient sequences with DNA from living populations. The pattern was striking. People with substantial ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa generally carried more Neanderthal-derived DNA than populations whose ancestry remained primarily within Africa. That suggested ancient interbreeding. The simplest explanation was that Homo sapiens leaving Africa encountered Neanderthals somewhere in Eurasia, probably in Western Asia, before expanding more widely. Those meetings left descendants, and those descendants eventually spread. Today, many people of European and Asian ancestry carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal-derived DNA individually. That percentage is small. Its importance is not. Different people inherited different pieces, so modern humanity collectively preserves a much larger share of the Neanderthal genome. Imagine thousands of travelers each carrying torn pages from the same lost book. Person has a paragraph. Another has a diagram. Someone else holds a page badly stained by time. Together they preserve far more than any single traveller could. Your genome works similarly. Neanderthal ancestry is not distributed as one tidy block. It appears in scattered segments shaped by recombination over tens of thousands of years. Every generation reshuffles the deck. Some fragments disappear. Others survive. Still others become common because they offer some advantage in a particular environment. You walk beside a small band moving through open woodland. Their footsteps press quietly into damp soil. A baby is carried against an adult's chest beneath a hide covering. The child cannot know that future scientists will treat such births as evidence of population contact. To the family, this is simply a child. That ordinary fact matters. Genetic admixture sounds technical because modern science describes it with statistics, ancestry, proportions, and sequence comparisons. But admixture happens through people. A meeting, a relationship, a pregnancy, a family. The genetic record preserves outcomes, not emotions. You cannot tell whether these encounters involved long partnerships, brief contact exchanges between neighbouring groups, or many different social arrangements. Researchers still debate how frequent such interactions were and whether they occurred mainly during a few major episodes or through repeated smaller contacts. The evidence increasingly suggests complexity. There was probably more than one pulse of interbreeding. Some early Homo sapiens individuals outside Africa carried remarkably recent Neanderthal ancestry. One famous example came from a modern human who lived in what is now Romania around 40,000 years ago. His genome suggested a Neanderthal ancestor only several generations back. That is not distant background ancestry. That is recent family history. You can almost imagine the genealogical awkwardness. Somewhere in that family line, a Neanderthal relative was not an abstract evolutionary cousin. They were grandparent-level ancestry. The categories begin to blur. Modern people often prefer clean labels. Neanderthal, Homo sapiens, us, them. Prehistory appears less cooperative. Biology does not always respect the borders we invent later. Two populations can remain distinct for long periods while still exchanging genes occasionally. That is common in nature. Human evolution was no exception. You hear the faint crackle of a newly fed fire. Someone beside you scrapes animal hide with a stone tool. The rough sound repeats steadily, almost like slow brushing. Around the camp, everyday life continues. Nobody announces that evolutionary history has changed. Perhaps that is the strangest part. The most consequential events can feel ordinary while they happen. A child learns to walk. A family moves camps. A young adult joins another group. A winter passes. Thousands of years later, geneticists discover that those small lives left measurable traces. Some Neanderthal ancestry appears to have been removed from the Homo sapiens genome over time. Natural selection likely reduced certain inherited variants that were harmful or poorly suited to modern human biology. Other fragments remained. A few may even have become useful. This uneven survival tells you that interbreeding was biologically complicated. Not every inherited sequence worked equally well. You are not carrying a perfect sample of Neanderthal DNA. You are carrying what survived repeated generations of filtering, chance migration, population growth, and selection. Even the chromosomes tell different stories. The modern human X chromosome contains relatively little Neanderthal ancestry compared with many other genomic regions. Researchers have proposed several explanations, including reduced fertility in some male hybrids or stronger selection against certain archaic variants. The exact balance remains debated. That uncertainty is important. Genetics can reveal that interbreeding happened. It cannot always reconstruct exactly how every biological consequence unfolded. There is another curious detail. Some regions of the modern human genome are sometimes described as Neanderthal deserts because they contain unusually little surviving Neanderthal ancestry. These genetic empty spaces may reflect areas where archaic variants were removed strongly over time. The name sounds wonderfully dramatic. A desert inside your chromosomes. No sound, thankfully. Only absence. Elsewhere, however, Neanderthal fragments survived at higher frequencies. Some became associated with aspects of immune function, skin biology, and responses to environments outside Africa. That makes evolutionary sense. Neanderthals had lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had already encountered local pathogens, climates, and seasonal conditions. When Homo sapiens arrived, interbreeding may have provided ready-made genetic variants shaped by those environments. You could call it inherited local knowledge, not learned knowledge, biological knowledge. A newcomer population enters unfamiliar territory and acquires useful variants from people whose ancestors have survived there for countless generations. Evolution can be surprisingly practical. Yet no ancient person understood this mechanism. They only lived. You follow the band toward a river as daylight weakens. Cold water slides over pale stones. The smell of wet earth rises from the bank and insects hover in the final warmth of evening. Two people walk ahead of you. One carries ancestry you would later call Homo sapiens. The other carries ancestry you would later call Neanderthal. Those labels do not tell you what they called each other. Perhaps nothing special. Perhaps something affectionate. Perhaps something rude. Humanity has always been inventive. Their descendants carry both histories. This is where the phrase ghost humans begins to feel less poetic and more literal in a genetic sense. Neanderthals vanished as distinct population, but they did not vanish completely. Their ancestry was absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations. A disappearance can therefore hide continuation. That complicates the word extinction. If a population no longer exists separately, yet pieces of its genome remain inside another, how complete? Complete was the ending. The answer depends on what you mean by survival. Their communities disappeared, their languages disappeared, their cultural traditions largely vanished, but portions of their biology remained. You carry echoes, not resurrected people. Still echoes matter. The river grows darker beside you. Someone lights a torch from the campfire, and resinous smoke curls into the cooling air. You now understand that the first ghost in your genome is not truly mysterious. Neanderthal ancestry has been identified, measured, mapped. The deeper mystery is what those inherited fragments still do. Some are silent passengers, others may influence the body carrying them, and that is where your journey goes next. Section 6. The torchlight beside the river disappears behind you, but the Neanderthal inheritance travels onward. Now you leave the ancient camp for something smaller, much smaller. You move inward past skin and muscle through tissues and cells until the prehistoric landscape becomes a landscape of chromosomes. Here the ghosts are harder to see. There are no footprints, no stone tools, no fires glowing against limestone walls. There are only sequences of genetic code copied from parent to child across thousands of generations. Some of those sequences entered Homo sapiens through ancient encounters with Neanderthals. A surprising number still remain. You might expect fragments this old to be useless leftovers drifting silently through modern genomes. Many probably are. Others, however, appear to influence how bodies respond to sunlight, infection, sleep, inflammation, and unfamiliar environments. The story becomes personal again. You imagine standing beneath a weak winter sun somewhere in ancient Eurasia. Cold air presses against your cheeks and frozen soil crunches beneath your feet. The smell of damp, woolly vegetation hangs near the ground. Your ancestors recently arrived from regions farther south. Their bodies now face unfamiliar seasonal rhythms. Neanderthals had endured variations of these conditions for far longer. They were not magically designed for cold. Evolution never works that cleanly. But populations living in one region for hundreds of thousands of years can accumulate genetic adaptations shaped by local pressures. When Homo sapiens mixed with them, some inherited variants entered the newcomer population. A few may have proved useful. One broad area involves immunity. Neanderthals encountered Eurasian bacteria, viruses, and parasites long before many Homo sapiens populations did. Certain archaic genetic variants associated with immune responses appear to have persisted at noticeable frequencies among later humans that could have offered advantages against unfamiliar infections. Imagine entering a valley full of pathogens your ancestors had rarely encountered. You cannot see them. You only smell wet soil, smoke, and animal fur. Yet your immune system is entering a biological world as foreign as the landscape itself. A useful inherited immune variant might improve survival without anyone understanding why. That is adaptive introgression. The phrase sounds technical. The principle is simple. You acquire DNA from another population and natural selection later favors some of those borrowed variants. Evolution sometimes takes shortcuts. It borrows from neighbors. Skin biology may offer another example. Different environments expose bodies to different amounts of ultraviolet radiation, humidity, cold, and seasonal light. Some Neanderthal-derived variants have been linked with keratin pigmentation and aspects of skin or hair biology. The details are complicated. A gene rarely determines one visible trait by itself, despite what inexpensive personality quizzes might imply. Still, ancient inherited variants may have contributed small pieces to adaptation in Eurasian environments. You rub your imagined hands together near a fire. The skin feels dry from cold wind. Smoke stings your eyes. Light fades earlier than you expect. Seasonality itself creates another challenge. Your body contains internal clocks. Hormones rise and fall according to daily rhythms, while sleep timing responds partly to light. Some studies have explored connections between Neanderthal-derived variants and circadian biology. Researchers have proposed that certain inherited differences may have influenced how ancient humans adjusted to northern daylight patterns. Loose summer days, short winter afternoons, Weeks when sunrise seems almost reluctant. That does not mean your desire to stay under blankets on a dark morning is directly caused by Neanderthals. It would be wonderfully convenient. Science is less accommodating. Modern sleep patterns are shaped by many genes, environments, habits, artificial lighting, schedules, and social behavior. Still, the connection between archaic ancestry and circadian regulation remains an intriguing area of research. You walk deeper into an imagined winter forest. Snow absorbs sound. The quiet feels almost physical. Branches release occasional drops of melting ice, and smoke from a distant hearth hangs close to the ground. Living here requires more than warm clothing. Your entire body responds to the rhythm of the place. Another cluster of archaic variants has been linked with metabolism. Food availability in Pleistocene Eurasia changed dramatically by season. Periods of abundance could alternate with scarcity. Different diets placed different demands on digestion and energy storage. Inherited genetic differences influencing fat metabolism or blood sugar regulation might therefore have carried advantages under certain conditions. Yet evolution does not plan for supermarkets. A variant beneficial during repeated food shortages might behave differently in an environment of constant calorie availability. This is one reason ancient adaptations can become complicated in modern settings. What once helped might later become neutral, or inconvenient, or occasionally harmful. The same principle applies to immunity. An aggressive immune response can protect against infection. It can also contribute to excessive inflammation. Some Neanderthal-derived variants have been associated with immune conditions in modern populations, although associations vary and rarely produce simple cause and effect explanations. Your genome is full of trade-offs. Nothing comes with a warranty. One especially curious example involves pain perception. Researchers have identified Neanderthal-related variants in a gene affecting sodium channels involved in nerve signaling. Certain versions have been associated with altered sensitivity to pain among living people. The finding inspired memorable headlines suggesting that Neanderthals experienced pain differently. The reality is more cautious. Pain is shaped by multiple biological and psychological systems. One inherited variant cannot tell you whether a Neanderthal complained loudly after stubbing a toe. That question regrettably remains beyond archaeology. Still, these genetic details offer intimate glimpses into bodies that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. I'll begin to realize something important. Neanderthal ancestry does not simply tell you where ancient populations met. It can sometimes reveal what natural selection preserved afterward. Some fragments became rare. Others survived by chance. A few increased because they provided useful effects. But determining which explanation fits each fragment remains difficult. Researchers continue to disagree about how many apparent adaptive effects truly resulted from Neanderthal introgression rather than later evolutionary changes within Homo sapiens. Population history can imitate selection. Selection can imitate chance. Modern environments can obscure ancient advantages. Genetic interpretation is rarely a straight road. You pass another small fire. Someone is grinding pigment against stone nearby. The scraping sound is slow and dry. A child runs a finger through reddish powder, leaving a streak across the skin before an adult gently moves the hand away. Whether pigment served decoration symbolism, practical purposes, or several roles remains debated at many Neanderthal sites. But the scene reminds you of a broader lesson. Genes never existed alone. Culture mattered too. A population could respond to cold with clothing, fire, shelter, mobility, cooperation, and inherited biology simultaneously. You should never imagine Neanderthal DNA as the single secret behind survival. Behavior often changes faster than genes. Knowledge can spread within one lifetime. Genetic adaptation takes generations. The two processes work together. That combination made ancient humans flexible. It also made their histories difficult to separate. You look again at the idea of your own genome. A few Neanderthal fragments may influence immune responses. Others may affect skin biology. Some may connect weakly with sleep timing, metabolism, or nerve function. Most will never produce an effect you notice. They do not make you partly Neanderthal in any simple sense. They make you the product of population history, a mosaic. That word fits better. Your chromosomes contain pieces from countless ancestors, most of whom lived ordinary lives and disappeared without names. Some belong to Homo sapiens, some belong to populations once considered entirely separate. All contributed to the inheritance travelling forward. The winter forest slowly brightens as morning returns. Ice glitters along a branch. You hear distant water beneath frozen ground moving where you cannot see it. The Neanderthal contribution is now becoming clearer, but another ghost waits farther east. Unlike Neanderthals, this population will first reveal itself through almost nothing at all. A tiny piece of bone, a cold Siberian cave, and DNA belonging to people nobody knew existed. Section 7. The winter forest gives way to mountains and the air grows thinner as you travel farther east. You are moving into southern Siberia now toward the Altai Mountains, where rocky ridges rise above cold valleys and dense forests. The landscape feels remote even today. In deep prehistory, it must have felt almost endless. Wind moves through pine branches with a low rushing sound carrying the sharp smell of resin and damp stone. Beneath your boots, the ground is cold enough to stiffen your toes. Ahead, a dark opening appears in a limestone cliff. It does not look especially dramatic. There are no carved pillars, no painted doorway, no warning that one of the greatest surprises in human evolution is waiting inside. This is Denisova Cave. You step into the entrance and immediately feel the temperature change. The air becomes cool and still. Moisture gathers onto rock while footsteps produce soft echoes beneath the uneven ceiling. Generations of humans have sheltered here. Neanderthals came. Denisovans came. Modern humans may have passed through the wider region as well. Layer after layer accumulated beneath the cave floor. Ash, bone, stone fragments, animal remains. Tiny objects dropped broken, forgotten, and buried. For archaeologists, such deposits are like pages in a book written mostly in dirt. The problem is that someone mixed the pages. Animals burrow. Water moves sediment. People dig pits. Later occupants disturb traces left by earlier visitors. Nothing is as tidy as a museum display. Then, in 2008, archaeologists working in the cave recovered something almost absurdly small. A fragment of a finger bone. It came from a young individual. At first glance, the bone did not announce anything revolutionary. It was simply another tiny human remain from an archaeological site already known to contain ancient occupation. Then scientists extracted dinner. That changed everything. The mitochondrial DNA looked unexpectedly different from both modern humans and known Neanderthals. Further analysis of nuclear DNA revealed something even more remarkable. This individual belonged to a population that geneticists had not previously recognized. A new ancient human lineage had entered the story. They became known as Denisovans. The name came from the cave. The people themselves never called themselves that. Whatever name they used disappeared with them. You stand deeper inside the chamber, listening to water drip somewhere beyond the firelight. Each drop seems unusually loud. The smell of smoke settles against the mineral scent of limestone. You look toward the place where that tiny fragment once rested beneath layers of sediment. A finger bone. That was enough. For most vanished human populations, discovery begins with recognizable anatomy. A skull suggests a different shape. Age-ore raises questions. Teeth reveal unexpected proportions. Denisovans reversed the process. DNA revealed the population before scientists possessed anything resembling a complete skeleton. It was like identifying an entire forgotten nation from one torn signature. That realization changes how you think about the archaeological record. How many populations have left similarly tiny traces? How many bones were never preserved? How many caves remain unexcavated? How many human groups vanished without leaving anything scientists can confidently recognize? The silence becomes larger. You move beside an archaeologist's imagined lamp. His light catches sediment in warm circles while the darkness beyond remains absolute. Another important Denisovan remain came from a large molar. Several Denisovan teeth discovered in the cave are unusually robust compared with many modern human teeth. They offer tantalizing anatomical clues, yet teeth cannot easily reconstruct an entire face. For years, scientists knew Denisovans primarily as genetic patterns attached to scattered fragments. Their bodies remained strangely absent. Then discoveries elsewhere began widening the picture. Age-ore found on the Tibetan plateau at Baishia Karst Cave was eventually linked to Denisovans through ancient protein evidence. This suggested that Denisovan-related people had occupied environments far beyond the Altai Mountains. Suddenly, the cave no longer looked like the center of their world. It looked like one small window into it. You imagine a map stretching across Asia. Mountains, forests, cold steppes, high plateaus, possibly warmer regions farther south. Genetic evidence in living populations suggests that Denisovan-related ancestry entered ancestors of people across parts of Asia and Oceania. That implies an enormous geographical story. Perhaps there were several Denisovan populations. Perhaps they differed substantially from one another. Researchers still debate how genetically diverse Denisovans were, and whether the label hides multiple deeply separated groups. The word Denisovan may eventually prove too simple. It could describe a broad family of related populations rather than one uniform people. That possibility feels appropriate. Prehistory keeps resisting tidy boxes. You return your attention to the cup. Among the stranger discoveries associated with Denisova is a beautifully polished stone bracelet from ancient layers. Its exact maker remains uncertain. The object demonstrates surprisingly skilled workmanship for such an early period. A drilled hole and polished surface suggest careful control of material and technique. You can almost imagine someone holding it near firelight. Smooth stone against skin, a small possession with meaning you cannot recover. Was it decoration, status, exchange, something ceremonial? Nobody knows, and scholars remain cautious about directly assigning every impressive object from the cave to Denisovans because archaeological layers can be complex. That uncertainty matters. A mysterious population should not become a convenient owner for every mysterious artifact. Still, the possibility is irresistible. Perhaps Denisovans made objects you would immediately recognize as beautiful. Perhaps their communities maintain traditions no surviving artifact has yet revealed. DNA can identify ancestry. It cannot preserve songs. You walk toward the cave entrance again. Outside snow has begun falling lightly. The flakes make almost no sound when they touch the ground. Your breath clouds in front of you as pale daylight reflects from the valley. Somewhere across this region, Denisovan groups once moved between shelters. They gathered food. They followed animals. They raised children. They probably argued over ordinary things. They may have met Neanderthals. In fact, genetic evidence proves that at least some did. That story will become astonishingly personal later. For now you remain with the young individual represented by that tiny finger fragment. She lived tens of thousands of years ago. You know almost nothing about her daily life. You do not know her name. You do not know what language she heard around the fire. You do not know whether she liked the cave-feared storms or preferred one relative's company over another. Yet part of her genome survived long enough to reveal an entire branch of humanity. There is something quietly humbling about that. A life can disappear almost completely. Then one molecule speaks, and the message travels across tens of thousands of years. You look back at the cave entrance as evening gathers over the Altai. Its darkness now feels less empty. Somewhere within those buried layers, the Denisovans waited without being known. And once their DNA emerged, the human family became stranger again. Section 8. The dark mouth of Denisova Cave remains behind you as the map of Asia slowly expands. At first, the Denisovans seemed almost imprisoned inside that one Siberian chamber. A finger bone, several teeth, fragments of day. That was barely enough to imagine a population, let alone an entire world. Then the evidence began spreading. You move south and east through mountain corridors, forested valleys, dry plateaus, and broad grasslands. The distances are immense. Cold wind becomes warmer air. Pine gives way to scrub. Snowfields retreat into high country while rivers cut through unfamiliar stone. Somewhere across this enormous region, Denisovan-related populations survive for tens of thousands of years, perhaps far longer. The difficult part is knowing where. Neanderthals left a comparatively rich skeletal record across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans did not. Their story arrives in fragments scattered across genetics, proteins, cave sediments, and a handful of bones. You are trying to reconstruct a person from footprints left in fog. The first major clue comes from living people. Modern populations in parts of Oceania carry substantial amounts of Denisovan-derived ancestry. Papuan and some indigenous Australian populations, for example, preserve noticeably more Denisovan ancestry than most populations farther west. That genetic pattern creates an obvious problem. Denisova Cave is in Siberia. New Guinea is very far away. If Denisovan ancestry reached populations whose ancestors moved towards Sahul, then Denisovan-related humans must have existed much farther south than the Altai. You watch the imagined map stretch between those places. Mountain ranges rise between them. Rivers twist across thousands of kilometers. Tropical forests appear where Siberian snow once dominated your view. The label Denisovan suddenly feels enormous. It may cover human populations adapted to dramatically different environments. One Denisovan community might have known freezing winters. Another may have lived beneath humid forests. Their shared ancestry did not require identical lives. Modern genetics hints at several episodes of interbreeding between Denisovan-related groups and Homo sapiens. Those episodes may have involved genetically distinct Denisovan populations. If so, there was never one simple Denisovan encounter. There were many. You walk beside a river somewhere in prehistoric Southeast Asia. The evening air is thick and warm. Insects hum beneath broad leaves while damp soil releases a rich, earthy smell after recent rain. Your skin feels sticky. Nothing about this place resembles the frozen entrance of Denisova Cave, yet people genetically related to those Siberian Denisovans may have lived somewhere within this wider world. Researchers continue debating how many separate Denisovan populations contributed ancestry to modern humans. Some genetic models suggest at least 2 deeply differentiated sources. Others divide the pattern differently. The precise number remains uncertain because scientists are reconstructing vanished populations from incomplete genetic echoes. There may be branches nobody has identified yet. This uncertainty creates one of the strangest possibilities in human evolution. A population can be scientifically real before anyone knows what it looked like. You can measure its contribution to living genomes. You can estimate when it diverged from related populations. You may even infer that different branches existed, yet its face remains missing. The body is almost absent, that feels backward. Normally, you imagine meeting a fossil first. Here, mathematics introduces you. You continue toward the Tibetan Plateau. The landscape rises gradually until breathing becomes harder. Grass lies close to the earth. The wind smells clean and dry, and every breath seems slightly too small for your lungs. At elevations that challenge many modern visitors, ancient humans were living surprisingly early. One remarkable fossil from the Tibetan Plateau changed the Denisovan story again. The Sierra mandible discovered at Baishia Karst Cave is a robust human jaw from the Middle Pleistocene. Researchers connected it with Denisovans using ancient protein analysis. DNA had not survived well enough for the original identification. Proteins did. That is a wonderfully strange detail. A vanished human population first revealed by DNA could later be recognized through molecules preserved inside an ancient jaw. Deep history sometimes survives by whichever chemistry proves least cooperative with decay. The jaw suggests Denisovan-related humans occupied the high Tibetan plateau long before modern Tibetan populations emerged. That means Denisovans were not merely wandering through easy lowlands. Some had adapted to demanding high-altitude environments. Cold temperatures were only part of the challenge. The greater problem was oxygen. At high elevation, every movement becomes more costly. Walking uphill feels heavier. Rest arrives sooner. Your heartbeat quickens. Yet ancient communities found ways to live here. Whether those adaptations were cultural, physiological, genetic, or some combination remains under investigation. You crouch beside an imagined hearth near a cave entrance. Yak-like animals graze far below. The fire smells sharply of smoke and dry fuel. Wind pushes at your clothing even inside the shelter. Someone nearby works a stone edge with slow concentration. Perhaps generations of Denisovan-related people knew these valleys intimately. Perhaps they knew seasonal routes modern researchers can only guess. The plateau does not feel empty now. It feels remembered. Another curious clue comes from cave sediment. Scientists have recovered Denisovan DNA directly from layers of dirt inside Denisova cave, even when recognizable human bones were absent. That means people left genetic traces simply by occupying a place. Tiny fragments from skin, hair, bodily fluids, or decomposed remains could settle into sediment and survive. Imagine leaving behind no grave, no skull, no tooth, only dust containing molecules that remain readable tens of thousands of years later. Prehistory has become unexpectedly forensic. This technique also reveals that Denisovans and Neanderthals used Denisova cave at different times. Their occupations overlapped across long stretches of prehistory. Sometimes one group appears, then another. Later Denisovans return. The cave seems less like one population's permanent home and more like a repeatedly used waypoint. You picture generations arriving beneath different climates. One group enters during bitter cold, another comes when conditions are milder. Children sleep where strangers slept thousands of years before. Nobody knows they are standing on layers of forgotten relatives. The cave remembers anyway. Still, the archaeological identity of Denisovans remains frustratingly uncertain. Scientists cannot simply pick up a stone tool and declare its maker Denisovan. Different human groups sometimes use similar technologies. The same cave could contain occupations by several populations. Scholars disagree about which artifacts can confidently be associated with Denisovans, especially when layers have been disturbed or dates overlap. This makes their culture difficult to define. Did they use ornaments? Probably, perhaps. Did they create symbolic objects? Possibly. Did they maintain regional traditions across Asia? Almost certainly, but identifying those traditions is another matter. The uncertainty should not tempt you into imagining them as culturally blank. Absence of evidence is partly an archaeological problem. Tropical environments destroy organic materials quickly. Many human remains never fossilize. Coastal sites vanish beneath rising seas. Entire migration routes may now sit underwater. A population can disappear from the visible record simply because preservation was unkind. You descend from the high plateau toward warmer country again. Night gathers gradually. Crickets replace the silence of snow. The smell of wet vegetation surrounds you, and somewhere unseen water moves between stones. You try to imagine Denisovan faces around another fire. Perhaps some look strongly different from Neanderthals. Perhaps certain features were surprisingly familiar. The truth remains frustratingly out of reach. Yet their genetic legacy is not. It stretches from Siberia toward East Asia, the Himalayas Island, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Different fragments point toward different encounters. Different populations carry different proportions. The Denisovans were not one mysterious family hiding forever inside a Siberian cave. They were part of a much wider human world, and as you follow their genetic traces farther south and east, you begin to see just how deeply they entered the ancestry of people still alive today. Section 9. You leave the warm river valley and follow the Denisovan trail farther across Asia, although there is no single trail to follow. That is the first thing you must accept. The old picture of human migration once looked reassuringly simple. Homo sapiens leaves Africa, moves eastward, spreads across Eurasia, and eventually reaches distant islands. Neat arrows cross the map. Real ancestry refuses to behave so politely. You now move through a world of branching routes, vanished coastlines, mountain corridors and islands connected differently than they are today. The sea itself has changed. During colder periods, so much water became locked inside great ice sheets that global sea levels fell dramatically. Coastlines extended outward. Some islands joined larger landmasses. Broad plains appeared where ocean water now rolls quietly above submerged landscapes. You walk across one of those forgotten plains. The morning air smells faintly of salt and wet grass. Wind slides over low vegetation and distant birds call from marshes that will one day disappear beneath the sea. Ahead of you, families move slowly eastward. They do not know that future scholars will call this region Sunderland. They only know the rivers, forest animals, and shorelines surrounding them. Parts of present-day Southeast Asia were connected into a much larger landmass during periods of low sea level, but the route toward New Guinea and Australia remained difficult. Deep water channels still separated islands. Crossing them required some form of deliberate water travel. That alone tells you something important. The people moving through this region were not simply wandering until land ran out. At some point they crossed water. Perhaps they used rafts. Perhaps simple boats. No vessel survives from such deep time, so the exact technology is unknown. Yet people reached Sahul, the ancient landmass combining Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, tens of thousands of years ago. Open water stood in their way. Someone looked across it and continued anyway. You hear waves breaking against a dark prehistoric shore. Wood shifts beneath your feet in the imagined craft. Salt dries against your skin and the smell of poke from the departing camp fades slowly behind you. It is uncomfortable. It is dangerous. It is also one of humanity's most extraordinary journeys, and some of the people making it already carried Denisovan ancestry. Modern genomic studies show especially strong Denisovan-derived ancestry among Papuan populations and some indigenous peoples of Oceania. The proportions vary among populations and individuals, but the signal is unmistakable. These inherited fragments cannot be explained by the Siberian cave alone. The ancestors of these populations must have encountered Denisovan-related humans somewhere along their journey eastward. Where exactly remains uncertain. Perhaps contact occurred in mainland Asia, perhaps farther south, perhaps several times. The genetic evidence increasingly suggests multiple encounters with different Denisovan-related populations. That possibility makes the ancient map feel crowded again. You pass through humid forest beneath towering trees. Water drips from leaves after an afternoon storm. The air smells of bark, mud, and decaying vegetation, and insects seem determined to inspect every exposed piece of skin. Somewhere nearby lives another human group. You cannot see them clearly. Their ancestors may have separated from the Siberian Denisovans long ago. They may look different. They may speak in ways entirely unfamiliar to the newcomers approaching their territory. Yet genetically they belong to the broad archaic family researchers now called Denisovan-related. This is where one label begins hiding enormous diversity. Imagine calling every population from Portugal to Japan by the name of one cave. Convenient certainly. Precise not especially. Researchers are aware of the problem. Genetic signals in East Asians, Papuans and other populations do not always point toward exactly the same archaic source. Some models suggest at least two distinct Denisovan-related contributions to modern humans. Others identify even more complicated possibilities. Researchers still debate how many separate archaic populations participated in these exchanges and where those meetings occurred. The uncertainty is not a weakness. It is a clue. If Denisovan-related groups were spread across enormous regions, they had hundreds of thousands of years to become genetically different from one another. A Siberian population and a tropical Southeast Asian population would not remain identical forever. Distances matter. Mountains matter. Climate matters. Isolation leaves signatures. You move farther east. The forest opens, occasionally revealing limestone cliffs and bright patches of scum. A strange thought follows you. Entire Denisovan-related populations may have lived in tropical regions where almost none of their bones survived. Heat, moisture, acidic soils, and active ecosystems destroy skeletal material far more rapidly than cold caves often do. The fossil record is biased. Cold places can preserve secrets. Tropical places often erase them. That means the best preserved Denisovan bones may come from regions that represented only part of their true range. It's like trying to understand a civilization using records preserved only in its driest warehouse. One quirky possibility sometimes discussed is that certain unidentified Asian fossils may eventually prove Denisovan. Researchers have proposed various candidates over the years, usually based on robust jaws, unusual teeth, or combination forms of archaic features. None should be accepted casually. A large molar is not a passport. Still, the idea remains tantalizing. Perhaps a Denisovan skull already sits inside a museum collection under another label. Perhaps the missing face is not missing at all. It may simply be misunderstood. You stop near a limestone shelter as evening settles. Someone cracks a nut with a stone. The sound echoes sharply. Smoke rises from a small fire, mixing with the heavy smell of wet vegetation. Children sleep nearby while adults repair tools in fading light. Nothing here looks like a migration map. That is another illusion you must discard. Migration is usually drawn as movement. For the people involved, it included long periods of staying. Generations might live in one valley before descendants move farther. Communities could split. Some groups turned north. Others followed coasts. Still others remained where they were. Then populations met again later. The result was not one wave. It was overlapping human histories. Genetic patterns across present-day Asia preserve some of that complexity. East Asian populations generally carry Denisovan ancestry at lower levels than Papuan populations, but the inherited fragments may not all derive from the same mixture event. South Asian populations show additional complicated patterns. Groups in Ireland, Southeast Asia can carry differing proportions of archaic ancestry depending upon their population histories. The numbers are not simple markers of identity. They are records of ancient encounters layered beneath later migrations. You walk along another shoreline at night. Moonlight lies across black water. Small waves make a soft, repeated hiss over stones, and cool salt air replaces the damp heat of the forest. Far beyond the horizon lies Sahul. The families around you cannot know how far their descendants will travel. Some will settle New Guinea. Others will move across ancient Australia. Over thousands of generations, populations will diversify. Languages will multiply and local histories will become extraordinarily rich. Yet small Denisovan genetic fragments will continue travelling through them. Those fragments are survivors of survivors. They pass through archaic humans first, then through early Homo sapiens, then through migrations, population bottlenecks, isolation, and countless births. The persistence is remarkable, and it offers one final surprise. Not every Denisovan fragment merely drifted through history. At least one became famous because it appears to have helped humans survive in one of the harshest inhabited environments on Earth. To find it, you must leave these warm shores. You must climb again, higher this time, toward thin air, fierce sunlight, and a plateau where breathing itself becomes work. Section 10. You leave the dark shoreline behind and begin climbing toward a place where even breathing becomes unfamiliar. The land rises steadily beneath you. Forests thin, trees become smaller. Then at last the horizon opens into a vast high plateau beneath an enormous blue sky. You are on the Tibetan Plateau. The sunlight feels sharp against your face, but the air remains cold. Wind moves across the grass with a dry whisper, carrying the smell of dust stone and distant animal dung burned as fuel. You take a deeper breath. It does not help much. There is simply less oxygen available in the air. At elevations above 4,000 meters, visitors from lower regions may feel headaches, exhaustion, disturbed sleep, or shortness of breath. Even simple walking becomes strangely demanding. Your heart beats faster. Your lungs work harder. The body notices immediately. Yet people have lived across these heights for thousands of years. And buried inside that remarkable story is one of the clearest examples of a ghost human helping later humans survive. You follow a narrow path across open grassland. Snow-covered mountains rise beyond the horizon, brilliant beneath the afternoon sun. A family moves ahead without the obvious struggle you feel. Their steps are steady. They carry loads. Children run short distances and recover easily. Their bodies have inherited generations of adaptation to high altitude. Modern Tibetan populations possess several physiological traits associated with living under chronic, low-oxygen conditions. One of the most fascinating involves a gene called EPAS1. The gene participates in how the body senses and responds to oxygen levels. Certain variants common among Tibetans are strongly associated with high-altitude adaptation, and the ancestry of this genetic pattern appears to reach back toward Denisovan-related humans. A ghost from deep prehistory climbed this mountain before you did. The discovery surprised researchers. Scientists examining Tibetan genomes noticed that a particular EPAS1 genetic pattern looked unusually different from comparable sequences in many other modern human populations. Then they compared it with archaic DNA. The resemblance to Denisovan sequences was striking. The most likely explanation was ancient interbreeding. Some ancestors of modern humans encountered Denisovan-related people acquired this genetic variant and later carried it into populations living at high elevations. Natural selection did the rest. In thin air, the inherited variant became valuable. You stop beside a shallow stream. Water runs beneath a rim of ice, producing a soft metallic trickle. Your hands feel numb from the wind, and every deep breath still seems strangely incomplete. The body normally responds to low oxygen by producing more red blood cells. That can help carry oxygen. But too many red blood cells make blood thicker, creating other physiological problems. Many Tibetan highlanders show a different response. Their bodies can function efficiently without producing the extremely elevated hemoglobin levels common in some other high-altitude populations. Variants around EPAS1 contribute to that pattern. It is a beautiful example of evolutionary compromise. You do not simply maximize one response, you balance several. Evolution is less like turning every dial to maximum and more like adjusting an ancient stove that becomes temperamental above 3,000 meters. The Denisovan connection makes the adaptation even stranger. Denisovan-related populations were living in Asia before Homo sapiens spread widely across the continent. Some appear to have occupied high-altitude environments surprisingly early. Remember the Xiaojiao from the Tibetan plateau. Its presence suggests Denisovan-related humans were familiar with these elevations long before later populations established deep roots here. Perhaps their ancestors had already faced generations of hypoxia. If so, Homo sapiens did not need to wait for an entirely new adaptation to arise. They inherited a useful solution. This is sometimes described as adaptive introgression. You have seen the principle before with immune-related genes. Here, however, the environmental connection feels unusually vivid. The wind itself explains the selection pressure. You breathe. Your chest tightens slightly. The ghost gene begins to make sense. A Denisovan-related individual once carried a version of this genetic region. At some unknown meeting that ancestry entered Homo sapiens. Much later, descendants carrying the useful variant reached high country. Those who handled low oxygen more effectively had an advantage. Generation after generation, the variant became increasingly common. No one understood genes. No one needed to. Children who survived passed ancestry forward. That was enough. You continue toward a temporary camp protected by a low stone wall. Smoke bends almost horizontally in the wind. Inside, warmth smells of burned fuel, cooked meat, leather, and wool. Someone hands you a warm container. Your fingers appreciate it before the rest of you does. Life at altitude involves more than oxygen. Cold matters. Ultraviolet radiation is intense. Growing seasons are short. Food production can be difficult. Weather changes rapidly. Human survival here required cultural adaptations alongside genetic ones. Clothing, shelter, herding, food storage, trade, and intimate knowledge of seasonal conditions all became essential. Genes never built the camp. People did. This distinction matters because dramatic stories about ancient DNA can sometimes make inherited biology sound like destiny. It is not. The EPAS1 variant is only one part of a complicated high-altitude adaptation system. Other genes matter. Development matters. Diet matters. Culture matters enormously. Researchers also continue debating the precise Denisovan-related population from which the EPAS1-associated ancestry originated. The sequenced Denisovan individual from Siberia may represent only one branch of a much larger archaic population. The actual source could have been related to that individual without belonging to exactly the same local group. Again, the name Denisovan hides diversity. You look south across the plateau. Cloud shadows move slowly over grassland. Somewhere beyond them are valleys that may once have connected different archaic populations across Asia. The true root of this genetic inheritance remains partly hidden. There is another uncertainty. Scientists continue refining when the advantageous variant entered ancestors of Tibetan populations and when natural selection became especially strong. Interbreeding may have occurred long before permanent high-altitude settlement. The genetic fragment could have traveled through lower elevation populations first. Only later did the plateau turn that quiet inheritance into something extraordinarily valuable. That possibility feels almost pedant. A gene can wait. For thousands of years, it may produce no dramatic advantage. Then descendants enter a new environment. Suddenly yesterday's inheritance becomes tomorrow's survival tool. You step outside again as dusk approaches. The temperature falls rapidly. Wind has softened, leaving a stillness so deep that distant animal bells carry across the plain. The sky darkens from blue to violet. Stars begin appearing earlier than expected. Your breathing has settled though, climbing still leaves you tired. Around you, Highland families continue ordinary routines. Someone checks animals, someone repairs a strap. A child leans against an older relative near the warmth of the shelter. Nothing about the scene announces ancient genetic history, yet that history is present. A fragment inherited from a vanished population helps connect these living people with humans who occupied Asia tens of thousands of years earlier. This is what makes ghost ancestry so remarkable. It is not merely evidence that populations met. Sometimes it changed what later humans could endure. A Denisovan-related lineage disappeared as a distinct people, but one of its genetic solutions survived the disappearance. It crossed population boundaries, it crossed generations, it climbed mountains, and eventually it became part of one of the most striking human adaptations known today. You breathe once more into the cold evening air. This time you think less about oxygen. You think about inheritance, about how something invisible can travel farther than any person. And somewhere behind you, buried deep inside the Denisovan story, waits an even more intimate discovery. Not a useful gene, not an anonymous fragment. A child. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. And after tens of thousands of years, part of her life would be found inside the same Siberian cave where this mystery began. Section 11. The thin air of the Tibetan plateau slowly falls behind you and your path bends north again towards the Altai Mountains. To return to Denisovans, its entrance looks almost unchanged from before, a dark opening beneath pale limestone and cold Siberian sky. Yet now you know what waits inside. Not simply traces of Denisovans, not simply traces of Neanderthals. Something far more personal lies buried within those ancient layers. You step across the cave floor as soft echoes follow your movements. The air smells of damp stone, old sediment, and faint wood smoke imagined from fires extinguished tens of thousands of years ago. Outside wind moves through the valley. Inside time feels strangely still. Among thousands of bone fragments recovered from this cave was one small piece that looked remarkably ordinary. It was not a skull. It was not a complete jaw. It carried no dramatic shape announcing that human history had just become more complicated. The fragment belonged to a long bone. Researchers initially knew almost nothing about the individual whose body had produced it. Then proteins identified the fragment as human. Ancient DNA revealed the rest. The individual is now commonly known as Denisova 11. She was a girl, and her parents came from two different archaic human populations. Her mother was Neanderthal. Her father was Denisovan. There is no distant ancestral mixture hiding several hundred generations behind her. This is immediate. One parent from each group. You pass beside an imagined fire. Something drips steadily from the cave ceiling, producing a hollow sound against stone. Smoke curls upward and gathers beneath darker sections of rock. Across the flame sits a teenage girl. You do not know her name. You cannot know her expression. You cannot know which parent she resembled more closely. But her genome preserves an extraordinary family story. Scientists estimated that she lived more than 50,000 years ago. Her mother belonged genetically to Neanderthals more closely related to later Western European Neanderthals than to some earlier Neanderthals previously found in the Altai. That detail suggests movement. Neanderthal populations were not permanently isolated inside tiny local territories. Groups, or at least their genes, travelled across vast portions of Eurasia. Her father belonged to the Denisovan lineage, yet even he carried traces of earlier Neanderthal ancestry. The family tree was tangled before this girl was born. Apparently prehistoric humanity did not consult modern species diagrams before choosing partners. The discovery matters because researchers already knew Neanderthals and Denisovans had exchanged genes. Their genomes contained evidence of ancient mixture, but genetic traces averaged across thousands of years can feel abstract. Denisova 11 makes this process immediate. Two people met. They belonged to populations separated by substantial evolutionary history. They had a daughter. That daughter survived long enough for her bones to develop beyond infancy. Everything else is silence. You imagine the circumstances. Perhaps her mother joined a Denisovan group. Perhaps her father travelled into the territory used by Neanderthals. Maybe both communities occasionally shared the same valleys. No evidence tells you which possibility is correct. The genome preserves parentage, not romance. It cannot tell you whether the union was welcomed, ordinary, unusual, temporary, or socially complicated. Researchers still debate how frequently first-generation hybrids like Denisova 11 appeared across Eurasia. Finding one among this tiny number of archaic individuals with high-quality genomes is striking. It may suggest that encounters happened more often than the sparse fossil record implies. But the sample is far too small for certainty. Perhaps scientists were extraordinarily lucky, or perhaps mixed families were not especially rare. You walk toward the cave entrance. Cold light spreads across the floor. Beyond it, the valley opens beneath patches of forest and rocky slopes. Imagine two populations moving through this landscape at different times. One knows the western valleys, another travels from farther east. Their territories overlap. Smoke becomes visible across a ridge. Tracks appear beside water. Someone finds a tool made using an unfamiliar technique. Eventually people meet. Would they immediately recognize each other as different? Almost certainly. Neanderthals and Denisovans had been separated for hundreds of thousands of years. Their bodies probably carried visible differences, although Denisovan appearance remains poorly understood. But visible difference does not automatically prevent intimacy. Modern humans themselves demonstrate enormous cultural and physical variation without becoming reproductively isolated. Ancient human boundaries may also have been flexible. You hear quiet scraping nearby. Someone is working hide with a stone edge. The repetitive sound mixes with wind entering the cave. A young person sits close to the wall, perhaps watching adults prepare food or repair equipment. Could Denisova 11 have grown up learning traditions from both parents? There is no way to know. Maybe the parents belonged to one community by the time she was born. Perhaps cultural identity followed the group rather than biological ancestry. Genes do not tell you which stories a child heard at night. They do not reveal whose language she spoke. That missing cultural world is enormous. Still, genetics offers one small additional surprise. The Neanderthal mother of Denisova 11 was not closely related to an older Neanderthal whose remains had also been discovered in Denisova cave. Instead, her ancestry was closer to Neanderthals living much farther west at later dates. This hints that Neanderthal populations moved or were replaced across the region. The Altai was not an isolated cul-de-sac. It was part of a wider human landscape. Groups arrived. Groups disappeared. Others returned. Denisovans used the cave during several periods as well. The cave became a crossroads. You can almost hear generations layered upon one another. A fire crackles 40,000 years ago. Another burns 20,000 years earlier. Of sands years earlier. Someone drops a tooth. Someone loses a tool. Someone leaves a fragment of bone that eventually becomes the only surviving witness to an entire family. Archaeology is full of grand conclusions built from embarrassingly small leftovers. Denisova 11 is one of the finest examples. Her existence also complicates the language of separate species. Neanderthals and Denisovans were genetically distinct populations. They had followed separate evolutionary paths for a long time, yet they could produce offspring together. Homo sapiens also interbred with both groups. Exactly how scientists should label these populations remains partly a matter of definition. Species boundaries in human evolution can be surprisingly fuzzy. Nature rarely draws thick black lines. Scientists do that afterward. The people themselves simply lived within whatever biological possibilities existed. You return to the imaginary girl beside the fire. Perhaps she carries wood. Perhaps she complains about cold. Perhaps she listens, while an older relative explains where animals gather after snow. None of these scenes can be recovered. They remain inventions wrapped around one astonishing biological fact. She united two archaic ancestries in one body, and her existence reminds you that the ancient world contained relationships, not merely populations. Maps show coloured territories, genomes show percentages, but real contact happened between individuals. That is where every genetic exchange begins. Night settles outside Denisova cave. The temperature drops and the smell of smoke thickens near the shelter entrance. You watch sparks lift briefly before disappearing into darkness. Somewhere in this ancient landscape, Neanderthal and Denisovan communities continue moving through overlapping worlds. Their descendants sometimes meet, sometimes they mix, sometimes their ancestry travels onward. Yet even these two groups may not account for every strange signal preserved inside human DNA. Beyond the people whose bones have been identified lies something more elusive. Populations with no confirmed face, no certain skeletons, perhaps not even names assigned by archaeology. Genetic shadows remain, and those shadows are waiting next. Section 12. The shadows beyond Denisova cave do not have faces. They do not have reconstructed skulls sitting beneath museum lights. No child has pressed a finger into clay beside their footprints. No archaeologist can confidently point toward one jaw and say this belonged to them, and yet they may have existed. You leave the cave and enter a different kind of prehistoric landscape, one built less from stone than from mathematics. The mountains fade. The firelight disappears. Around you now are invisible family trees, branching populations, broken lineages, and genetic sequences compared across thousands of living people. This is where human evolution becomes strangely ghostly. A population does not always need a fossil to announce itself. Sometimes its descendants carry enough unusual DNA for scientists to infer that another group once contributed to their ancestry. Researchers often call such vanished populations ghost populations. The name sounds wonderfully dramatic. You might imagine translucent hunters drifting silently through prehistoric forests, which would certainly make archaeological fieldwork more interesting. The reality is quieter. A genetic ghost is an ancestral population inferred from patterns inside genomes, even when scientists cannot confidently connect it with known fossils. You stand beside an imagined river beneath a warm African evening. Cicadas hum in distant trees. The ground smells of damp soil, crushed grass and cooling dust after a brief afternoon rain. Across the water, another group watches from beneath scattered branches. You cannot identify them. Perhaps they belong to an early Homo sapiens population separated from your group for many thousands of years. Perhaps their ancestors diverged much earlier. Maybe they belong to a lineage that modern researchers have never named. All you know is that people meet. Some descendants inherit ancestry from both groups. Then time erases almost everything. The camps vanish. Organic tools decay. Rivers shift. Bones dissolve inside acidic soil. The genetic fragments continue traveling. This is one reason Africa has become especially important in discussions of ghost ancestry. The continent preserves the deepest history of Homo sapiens, yet ancient DNA preservation. There can be extremely difficult. Heat damages genetic material. Moisture accelerates decay. Microorganisms are remarkably efficient destroyers of molecular evidence. A cold Siberian cave can protect DNA for extraordinary periods. A tropical environment may erase it quickly. Preservation has preferences. Unfortunately, those preferences are not designed for historians. This creates a strange imbalance. Researchers possess high-quality genomes from several Eurasian archaic humans, including Neanderthals and Denisovans. Yet Africa, where much older and more diverse human histories unfolded, has yielded fewer comparably ancient genomes. Scientists therefore examine living populations and more recent ancient DNA for signals of deeper ancestry. Some studies have identified genetic segments that appear unusually divergent from typical modern human variation. One possible explanation involves mixture with archaic populations. Another explanation involves ancient structure within Homo sapiens itself. The distinction matters greatly. Imagine two villages separated for a very long time. Their ancestors belong to the same broad population, but mountains and changing climate restrict contact. Over thousands of generations, their genetic differences deepen. Later, the villages reconnect. Their descendants now carry ancestry from two long-separated branches. A geneticist studying them much later might detect an unusually old divergence. But no mysterious species was required. The ghost could be your own distant cousin. Researchers remain divided over how often proposed African archaic signals truly require admixture from highly divergent human lineages. Some models favor unknown archaic populations. Others show that complicated Homo sapiens population structure can produce similar patterns. The debate remains open. You walk through tall grass while evening deepens. Seed heads brush against your hands. Somewhere nearby, frogs begin calling from shallow water and smoke from a distant hearth settles into the warm air. The people surrounding you are mobile. Groups divide. Relatives leave. Drought pushes one community east while improving rainfall later draws another group west. Nothing stays isolated forever. Africa's enormous size amplifies this complexity. Forests expand and contract. Deserts appear and soften. River systems change course. Mountain ranges create barriers while grassland corridors sometimes reconnect distant populations. Human ancestry becomes braided long before anyone leaves the continent permanently. This makes the phrase one origin deceptively simple. Homo sapiens certainly evolved, but researchers increasingly examine models in which our species emerged through interactions among several African populations rather than one tiny ancestral group living in one location. The fossils themselves encourage caution. Early Homo sapiens remains have been found across widely separated parts of Africa. Some display combinations of features that do not fit a perfectly linear transformation toward modern anatomy. The pattern resembles a continent full of connected experiments. Not experiments in the intentional sense, just populations changing. One quirky reminder comes from the difficulty of deciding where some fossils belong. A skull can spend decades moving between labels as researchers revise dates, compare new specimens, and redefine species. The dead are remarkably patient about administrative confusion. Nature never promised to organize itself around museum drawers. You approach a shallow rock shelter. Someone has left stone flakes beside an old hearth. The edges feel sharp when you lift one carefully. You can smell charcoal in the sediment, although the fire itself disappeared countless generations ago. Could a ghost population have made these tools? Possibly. But stone tools rarely identify biological ancestry by themselves. Different groups can use similar technologies. Ideas can spread between populations. Two communities facing the same practical problem may independently discover comparable solutions. A scraper does not carry a family name. This is why genetics became so powerful. DNA can reveal relationships that artifacts cannot. Researchers compare sections of genomes and estimate how long ago ancestral populations separated. They also look for patterns suggesting later gene flow between branches. If a population contains DNA too divergent to fit expected relationships, scientists may propose an unsampled ancestor. That ancestor becomes a ghost. The process resembles hearing an unfamiliar voice inside an old recording. You cannot see the speaker. You may not know their name, but the conversation makes little sense unless someone else was in the room. Still, statistical models depend upon assumptions. Population size matters. Migration rates matter. How groups split matters. An incorrect model of population history can create a convincing but misleading ghost. Scientists therefore test competing scenarios. One model may require archaic admixture. Another may reproduce the same pattern through deep population structure. A third may include several mixture events. The mystery grows rather than disappears. You might find that frustrating. Instead, let it feel spacious. Human prehistory is allowed to contain uncertainty. The unknown populations are not failures of knowledge. They are reminders of how much history vanished before anyone could record it. Imagine all the people who left no recognizable fossil. They still woke each morning. They carried children. They searched for food. They learned paths through familiar landscapes. They may have sung. They almost certainly argued. Then their communities disappeared, leaving perhaps only shattered ancestry and descendants who never knew their names. You sit beside another quiet fire. Warm air touches one side of your face while the other remains cool beneath the night breeze. Wood pops softly. The smell of smoke mixes with wet leaves. Across the flames you imagine a person belonging to one of these unknown populations. You cannot reconstruct their face. Perhaps future discoveries will change that. A single tooth could appear. A fragment of skull might be reclassified. New methods could recover proteins or DNA from sediments where bones never survived. Science has done stranger things already. For now, the person remains invisible. Yet their possible genetic traces challenge the idea that humanity can be reduced to a few famous names. Neanderthal, Denisovan, Homo sapiens. Those labels describe important branches. They may not describe everyone. There could have been other populations across Africa and Eurasia whose contributions remain partly hidden. Some may eventually receive names. Others may remain mathematical shadows forever. The fire sinks lower. Darkness settles around the shelter and insect sounds become steady beyond the light. You have reached the edge of what bones can easily tell you. From here, your journey turns back toward Africa, where the deepest chapters of Homo sapiens ancestry remain both richly populated and frustratingly difficult to recover. There the ghosts become even older, and the argument over who they were becomes much harder to resolve. Section 13. You turn south again, away from Siberian caves and high plateaus toward the continent where the oldest chapters of your species began. Africa waits beneath a wider sky. The landscapes change slowly as you travel. Dry grasslands give way to wooded valleys, then to river systems, rocky highlands, humid forests, and broader regions where rain arrives only seasonally. There is no single African environment. There never was. That matters because early Homo sapiens populations were scattered across an enormous continent, often separated by ecological barriers that changed repeatedly over thousands of years. You walk through tall grass in the fading afternoon. Warm wind moves against your arms. The air smells of dust, sun-heated stone and distant rain while insects pulse steadily somewhere beyond the trees. A small human group travels ahead. They look familiar. If you passed them on a modern street with different clothing, some features might barely surprise you. Yet their ancestry is complicated. Behind them stretch generations of movement, separation, reunion, and exchange between populations whose names are completely lost. For a long time, stories of human origins favored a simple picture. Modern humans appeared in one small region of Africa. Then they expanded. The rest followed. That model was easy to draw. One point on a map, several arrows leaving it, but fossils, archaeology, and genetics increasingly suggest a more complicated African beginning. Different populations may have occupied separate regions for long periods while remaining connected through occasional migration. Rather than one isolated birthplace, Homo sapiens may have emerged from a network. You could imagine distant campfires flickering across a continent. Some communities rarely meet. Others exchange partners. Climate closes one corridor and opens another. A population disappears locally, then distant relatives enter centuries later. Over enough time traits spread, so does ancestry. The result is not a neat trunk. It is a woven landscape. You follow a river toward a cluster of acacia trees. Birds call sharply from the branches, your feet sink slightly into soft mud near the water, and the coolness feels pleasant after hours beneath the sun. Across the river another group has stopped. They are not strangers in the absolute sense. Their ancestors and yours may share deep roots. Still, long separation has created genetic differences. Perhaps contact has been rare for thousands of years, perhaps much longer. Then the river becomes crossable. People meet again. This kind of population structure can produce genetic patterns that look astonishingly ancient. And here lies one of the great puzzles of African human evolution. Some studies of living African genomes have identified genetic segments that appear unusually divergent. One interpretation suggested mixture with archaic human populations whose genomes have never been directly sampled. These are the African ghost populations, but their identity remains uncertain. They might represent deeply separated human lineages, or they might reflect ancient subdivisions within early Homo sapiens populations. The difference is subtle, yet it changes the story. If true archaic populations contributed, then Africa may have contained forms of humans living alongside early Homo sapiens, just as Eurasia contained Neanderthals and Denisovans. If population structure explains the signals instead, the mystery remains fascinating for another reason. Our own ancestors may have been divided into strongly differentiated communities before repeatedly reconnecting. Either way, the old idea of one uniform ancestral population becomes difficult to defend. You hear stone striking stone near a shallow shelter. A person sits in the shade shaping a flake with patient blows. The sound is dry and measured. Nearby, someone crushes plant material between stones, releasing a sharp green smell into the warm air. Life continues quietly. Nobody here knows whether future researchers will call the modern archaic transitional or something less elegant. Those labels come much later. The people only know to kinship. They know who shares food. They know who can be trusted near children. They know which neighbouring group has good stone. That knowledge may shape genetic history more than any scientific category ever could. One curious complication comes from Africa's fossil record. Several ancient human fossils combine traits that researchers once expected to appear in cleaner sequences. A skull may have a relatively modern face but an elongated brain case. Another specimen may preserve more archaic features alongside traits associated with Homo sapiens. Evolution seems to have assembled modern anatomy gradually and unevenly. The pieces did not all arrive together. That should make you suspicious of simple boundaries. A population can look modern in one anatomical feature and older in another. Genes can tell a similarly mixed story. Researchers still argue over how to interpret certain deep genetic lineages found among African populations. Some models estimate that unknown groups diverged from ancestors of modern humans hundreds of thousands of years ago before later contributing ancestry. Other models reproduce similar signals without requiring a separate archaic population at all. The mathematics can support several plausible histories. That uncertainty is not going away quickly. Africa presents a preservation problem. Ancient DNA survives best in cool, stable environments. Much of Africa is neither. Heat breaks DNA apart. Moisture accelerates chemical damage. Microbes finish the job with admirable enthusiasm. A Siberian bone can preserve genetic material for extraordinary lengths of time. An African bone of similar age may contain almost nothing readable. This means the deepest African history is often reconstructed indirectly. Living genomes become archaeological sites. You carry the excavation inside blood and tissue. That thought feels strangely intimate. A genetic sequence can survive after every tool campsite and spoken word connected to its original population disappears. You continue toward higher ground as evening approaches. The smell of rain grows stronger. Then thunder rolls somewhere beyond the horizon. The sound arrives slowly, low and distant. Perhaps storms like this once separated populations. A river swells. A grassland becomes wetland. A familiar route closes. Families remain apart for generations. Then conditions shift again. Contact resumes. Climate becomes a hidden character in the genetic story. During wetter periods, lakes and rivers connect habitats. During drier periods, deserts and shrinking forests isolate communities. Africa repeatedly rearranges the pathways through which humans can move. Population boundaries breathe with the landscape. One fringe possibility occasionally enters discussions of ghost ancestry. Could some unknown genetic contribution come from late surviving populations related to more ancient members of the genus Homo? It is an intriguing idea, but there is currently no simple genetic fingerprint allowing scientists to identify such a group confidently. Without ancient genome, speculation outruns evidence quickly. The ghost must remain unnamed. You settle near a fire beneath a rock overhang. Rain begins tapping against stone. The smell of wet earth becomes strong and soothing, while water gathers in small channels beside the shelter. Across the flames sit people whose descendants may eventually merge with distant populations. Some ancestry will spread, some will vanish. Some will survive in small fragments for hundreds of thousands of years. This is why Africa matters so deeply to the ghost human story. The continent was never merely the starting point before the interesting migrations began. It contained enormous human diversity of its own. Populations separated. They changed. They met again. Some may have belonged to lineages we have not yet identified. Others may have been early branches within Homo sapiens itself. The distinction remains unresolved. You listen to rain soften outside. The fire gives off steady warmth against your hands. Far away, another group shelters beneath another ridge carrying genetic histories that may not meet yours for thousands of years. And somewhere behind both groups lies an even older separation. A population so ancient that its descendants may have mixed with Neanderthals, Denisovans, or their ancestors long before Homo sapiens entered Eurasia. The ghosts are about to become older still. Section 14. The rain beneath the African rock shelter fades and your journey slips backward once more. Not thousands of years, not tens of thousands, much farther. You move beyond the familiar encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, beyond the Denisovan cave, and into a period when even those lineages were still taking shape. The landscape becomes harder to recognize. Glacial cycles come and go across enormous stretches of time. Forests retreat grasslands spread and ancient rivers carve valleys no modern traveler would recognize. Human populations are already moving through this changing world. But these humans belong to branches so old that their relationships become difficult to name. Some geneticists use an evocative term for one possibility. Super archaic. The word sounds like something invented for a particularly ambitious prehistoric monster movie. In genetics, however, it refers more cautiously to a very deeply separated human population inferred through models of ancient ancestry. You walk across an open valley beneath a cold, pale sky. Dry grass brushes against your legs. The wind carries the smell of stone dust and distant animals. While somewhere beyond a ridge, a group of early humans moves toward water. You cannot tell who they are. No label floats above them. Their descendants may eventually contribute ancestry to populations ancestral to Neanderthals, Denisovans, or other archaic humans. Or perhaps their history took another path. The evidence is indirect. That is what makes the super-archaic mystery so unusual. Researchers studying ancient genomes noticed that some patterns inside Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry could be explained more easily if their ancestors had mixed with an even older population. This proposed population may have separated from other human lineages hundreds of thousands of years earlier, possibly much earlier. If those models are correct, then interbreeding between deeply separated human groups began long before Homo sapiens entered Eurasia. The tangled family tree was already tangled. You pause near a shallow stream. Water moves quietly over rounded stones. The air is cold enough to numb your fingertips, and every sound seems sharper beneath the open sky. Across the water, another group appears. They look human, but perhaps their ancestors diverged from yours an astonishingly long time ago. Imagine what that means. By the time they meet, both populations may have changed anatomically, genetically, and culturally. Their tools may differ. Their social habits may differ. Even their communication systems could have diverged. Yet biological separation may still be incomplete. Children might still be possible. That possibility has forced researchers to reconsider how long human lineages could remain distinct without becoming completely reproductively isolated. You have already seen this with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Now the same principle may extend far deeper. One mainstream fact anchors the mystery. Genetic evidence indicates that Neanderthals and Denisovans shared an ancestral population after separating from the lineage leading toward modern Homo sapiens. Later Neanderthals and Denisovans themselves diverged. Yet their genomes also preserve signs of additional mixture. The clean branching diagram begins collapsing again. Instead of one branch splitting neatly into two populations may separate and later exchange genes. Then descendants split again. Evolution starts to resemble braided rope. You can pull on one strand, several others tighten. A proposed super-archaic population may have contributed genetic material to ancestors of Denisovans. Some models also suggest complex exchanges involving ancestors of both Neanderthals and Denisovans. The dates are enormous. The uncertainty is equally enormous. Researchers continue arguing over how many deeply divergent populations are actually required to explain these patterns. Different genetic models can produce different estimates of when populations split and later reconnected. Population size complicates everything. So does incomplete sampling. You cannot sequence genomes from people whose bones have never been found. The ghosts remain mathematically present but physically absent. You continue toward a wooded slope. Leaves crackle beneath your feet. A faint smoky smell reaches you before you see the fire. Another group has occupied a shallow shelter ahead. Their tools seem simple compared with later technologies, yet simplicity should not be mistaken for incompetence. A tool only needs to work. A hand axe can remain useful for hundreds of thousands of years without caring whether archaeologists find it fashionable. That durability leads to one quirky mystery. Across vast parts of Africa and Eurasia, broadly similar, Acheulean hand axes appear for extraordinary spans of prehistoric time. Researchers debate how traditions lasting so long were transmitted and reinvented across changing populations. Some tools look almost symmetrical enough to seem aesthetic. Perhaps makers appreciated form. Perhaps symmetry simply improved function. Perhaps both. Stone offers hints. It rarely offers explanations. Could a super-archaic population have made tools already sitting inside museum collections? Possibly. There is no reliable way to match every ancient artifact with a specific biological population. A hand axe cannot provide data. That creates an odd situation. Archaeologists may possess objects made by a ghost population without knowing which hands shaped them. Perhaps even fossils currently assigned to broad categories will eventually be connected with these genetic signals. Names such as Homo erectus immediately attract attention. This species, broadly defined, survived across parts of Africa and Asia for an extraordinary span of time. Could deeply divergent ancestry have come from a population related to Homo erectus? It is tempting. It is also speculative. No confirmed Homo erectus genome currently allows a direct genetic comparison. The idea remains one of those intriguing edges where evidence thins and imagination becomes impatient. You resist the temptation to force an answer. That is part of travelling this far back. Certainty becomes a luxury. Fossils grow rarer. DNA disappears. Dates widen into ranges. Population labels become provisional. What remains clear is that ancient humans were moving across continents long before Homo sapiens existed. Some populations became isolated, others reconnected. Occasional gene flow may have crossed surprisingly deep evolutionary divisions. You sit beside another prehistoric fire. The flames are small. Smoke smells bitter in the evening air and the warmth barely reaches beyond the people gathered nearby. Someone turns a piece of meat over glowing embers. Another person examines the edge of a stone tool. A child sleeps against an adult. Whatever label future scientists might assign these people, their evening looks ordinary. That is becoming a recurring lesson. The deeper you travel, the stranger the genetics become. The lives remain familiar. People need warmth. They need food. They need companions. They need places safe enough for children to sleep. It is easy to make super-archaic ancestry sound supernatural, but the people behind those signals were not ghosts to themselves. They had bodies. They occupied real valleys. They experienced weather. Their feet hurt. They probably disliked smoke blowing into their faces. They were simply alive. Only time made them mysterious. You look toward the horizon as darkness gathers. Somewhere beyond it, one ancient population is separating from another. Thousands of generations will pass before their descendants meet again. When they do, fragments of ancestry may cross the divide. Those fragments could travel through Denisovans, through Neanderthals, perhaps through later Homo sapiens populations, and eventually into genetic models studied today. The journey is almost too long to imagine. Yet molecules sometimes remember what bones forget. And soon you will return to a place where even bones are unnecessary. Their scientists will recover human presence directly from cave sediment. No skeleton required, only dust. Section 15. The fire beside the ancient shelter sinks into darkness and the world around you becomes quieter than before. You are returning underground, but this time you are not searching for a skull, a tooth, or a carefully preserved fragment of bone. You are searching for dirt. The idea sounds almost disappointingly ordinary. After everything you have seen so far, perhaps you expected some dramatic fossil resting beneath torchlight. Instead, you kneel on the cave floor. Cold sediment presses beneath your fingertips. The air smells of limestone, damp earth, and dust disturbed by careful excavation. Around you, archaeologists remove soil in thin layers. Every movement is measured. A brush whispers across the ground. A small metal tool scrapes gently against compacted sediment. Nothing here looks especially human. Yet the cave floor may contain traces of people who vanished tens of thousands of years ago. Their bodies are gone. Their DNA is not. This is one of the most remarkable developments in ancient genetics. Scientists can sometimes recover human DNA directly from archaeological sediments, even when no identifiable human bones are present. The genetic material may come from tiny biological traces left behind during occupation. Skin cells, hair, bodily fluids, decomposed tissues, perhaps microscopic fragments from remains disturbed long ago. Nobody knows the source of every molecule. The sediment simply became a quiet archive. You lift a small handful of soil. It feels slightly gritty. To your eyes, it contains almost nothing. To molecular scientists, it may contain an entire population history. Ancient DNA preservation depends heavily on environmental conditions. Cold, stable caves are especially valuable because lower temperatures slow molecular breakdown. That is one reason Denisova Cave became so important. Its sediments preserve traces of Neanderthals and Denisovans across different periods of occupation. Researchers could detect who had been there even when skeletal remains were missing from a particular layer. The cave remembered its visitors. Not metaphorically, this time I mean chemically. You imagine a Denisovan walking across this floor tens of thousands of years earlier, a fur-covering brushes against the wall. Someone sits near a hearth. A child scrapes dirt with a stick. Food is prepared. People sleep. Perhaps an injured hand leaves a few cells behind. Perhaps hair falls unnoticed near the fire. Nothing about the moment seems important. Then sediment accumulates. Dust settles. New occupants arrive. Alive. Centuries become millennia. Those tiny traces disappear from sight while remaining partly preserved within the ground. Much later, a scientist collects several grams of sediment and discovers human ancestry hidden inside it. Deep history can be absurdly economical. You do not always need a skeleton. Sometimes a spoonful of dirt will do. Of course, the process is not simple. Ancient DNA molecules are often extremely short and damaged. Modern contamination can overwhelm the original signal. Researchers must work carefully to separate authentic ancient fragments. DNA, introduced by excavation teams, laboratory workers, or later visitors. Protective clothing matters. Sterile procedures matter. Sampling strategy matters. A careless touch can add more modern genetic material than thousands of years of ancient occupation left behind. You watch researchers package sediment samples carefully. Gloves cover their hands. Each bag receives information about location, depth, layer, and context. Archaeology becomes almost surgical. The older romantic image of excavation involved brushes, notebooks, and adventurous people discovering impressive bones. Now molecular biology has joined the cave. The dust gets a laboratory appointment. Sedimentary DNA has allowed researchers to identify alternating occupations by different human populations. At Denisova Cave, genetic traces showed changes between Neanderthal and Denisovan presence across long periods. This helps reconstruct a complicated history of movement. One group appears, later another occupies the cave. Then ancestry changes again. Climate may have influenced these patterns. Population shifts may have mattered. Regional migrations probably mattered too. But the sediment cannot tell you why someone left. It only tells you that someone was there. You move through another imagined cave farther west. The stone walls feel cold beneath your palm. A faint mineral smell mixes with moisture. Water drips somewhere in the darkness, each sound followed by a soft echo. The floor contains thousands of years of occupation. Some layers include tools but almost no human bone. Before sedimentary DNA, those layers could be biologically anonymous. Now they may speak. Researchers have recovered Neanderthal DNA from cave sediments in several locations. This allows scientists to compare genetic populations across time without depending entirely on rare fossils. In some cases, sedimentary DNA may reveal that one Neanderthal population was replaced by another. That is astonishingly detailed information from material nobody once considered a genetic archive. You'll begin to realize how preservation biases shaped older ideas about human evolution. Scientists naturally studied places where fossils survived, but fossil survival is uneven. Bones disappear easily. Some soils dissolve them. Animals scatter them. Water destroys them. Human occupation does not always involve burial inside convenient caves. Sedimentary DNA broadens the search. A population can leave evidence without leaving recognizable anatomy. That possibility matters greatly for ghost humans. If an unknown archaic population occupied a cave with favorable preservation, perhaps its DNA remains beneath the floor even if no bones survived. One future sample could reveal another lineage. It has happened before. That possibility has made some researchers reconsider old excavation sites. Stored sediments may contain molecular information nobody thought to examine when they were collected. Imagine an archaeological box sitting quietly in a laboratory archive for decades. Its contents seem unremarkable. Then new technology arrives. Suddenly, the old dirt becomes valuable. It is one of archaeology's gentler ironies. Yesterday's boring sample becomes tomorrow's breakthrough. Still, sedimentary DNA carries serious limitations. Molecules can move through soil. Water may shift material between layers. Animals disturb deposits. Later human activity can mix contexts. Researchers must determine whether genetic material truly belongs to the archaeological layer where it was found. Scientists continue debating the best methods for tracing how DNA binds to mineral particles and moves through different sediments. Dating also requires care. DNA itself does not always provide a simple calendar date. Its archaeological context remains essential. A genetic signal without reliable stratigraphy can become difficult to interpret. You kneel beside another, carefully exposed layer. Tiny flecks of charcoal appear against brown soil. The smell of earth is cool and slightly metallic. Your fingers remain away from the sample now. You have learned respect for dirt. Somewhere inside this layer may be DNA from an individual whose entire body has vanished. Perhaps that person was Neanderthal. Perhaps Denisovan. Perhaps someone more mysterious. You imagine them entering the cave during heavy rain. Water runs down their clothing. Someone shakes moisture from an animal hide. Another person adds wood to the hearth. Smoke fills the chamber before drifting toward the entrance. They remain for several nights. Then they leave. No grave remains. No name survives. Nothing visible marks their stay. Yet they may have shed enough microscopic material for you to detect them thousands of generations later. That changes the meaning of absence. A cave without human bones is not necessarily a cave without humans. A region lacking fossils may still have contained populations. The archaeological silence may sometimes reflect preservation rather than reality. This is especially important when thinking about Denisovans. Their skeletal record remains extremely sparse, but sedimentary DNA has expanded evidence for their presence at Denisova Cave. Future work elsewhere could potentially extend their known range. High mountains, coldest caves, and other favorable environments may preserve additional traces. Scientists are also developing methods for identifying DNA from broader environmental samples. Plants and animals appear alongside human signals. A single sediment layer can therefore reveal parts of an ancient ecosystem. You might detect humans, prey animals, predators, and vegetation from roughly the same period. The cave becomes more than a shelter. It becomes an environmental archive. You listen to the imagined sounds. Horse calls somewhere outside. Wind moves across the entrance. Inside, stone tools strike softly while a fire gives off resinous smoke. The people seem present again, not because you found their faces, because chemistry placed them here. That is perhaps the strangest lesson of ancient DNA. History does not always survive in the forms you expect. A bone can vanish. A campsite can disappear. A population can become genetically invisible, except for microscopic fragments trapped between mineral grains. But enough fragments can rebuild a presence. You stand and move toward the cave entrance. Morning light spills across the floor, illuminating dust suspended in the air. Those particles drift slowly downward. Some will settle. Some will remain. The sight feels almost ceremonial now. Every human body leaves traces. Most vanish. A few become history. And once scientists learn to read those traces, the living world itself becomes an archive. The next step is to bring that archive forward, not through caves this time, through living people. You will watch researchers compare modern genomes using patterns inside millions of descendants to reconstruct migrations, meetings, disappearances, and ancient relationships no storyteller ever recorded. Section 60. You leave the cave behind, but the archive does not disappear. It simply moves. Instead of kneeling in cold sediment, you now stand inside a different landscape, one made from living genomes. The room is quiet. Computer fans hum softly. A cup of coffee cools somewhere nearby, and fluorescent light reflects from rows of screens filled with letters representing day. A, C, G, T, 4 symbols. That is enough to record an extraordinary amount of human history. You look at the sequence scrolling before you. At first it seems meaningless. Millions upon millions of genetic letters pass in patterns too dense for the eye to interpret directly. Yet hidden inside them are ancient migrations, population splits, unexpected reunions, bottlenecks, interbreeding, sometimes even the shadow of a population nobody has ever excavated. The remarkable thing is that you do not need to sequence a prehistoric skeleton to begin. Living people carry inherited fragments of ancient history. Every genome is a family archive, not a complete one, not a perfectly organized one. Still enough fragments survive for researchers to reconstruct events that happened tens of thousands of years before writing existed. You imagine taking 2 modern genomes and laying them beside each other. Most of the sequence looks overwhelmingly similar. Humans are genetically very close as a species, but small differences matter. Some variants are common in one population and rare in another. Some stretches appear unusually similar to ancient Neanderthal DNA. Others resemble Denisovan sequence. Patterns across many individuals allow scientists to estimate how populations are related. This is where statistics becomes a kind of time machine, not the exciting kind with flashing lights. Mostly the kind with the enormous data sets and someone quietly wondering why the analysis failed at 2 in the morning. Still, the results can be astonishing. One mainstream method involves comparing shared genetic variants between populations. If one modern population shares unexpectedly many derived variants with Neanderthals, for example, that pattern can suggest ancient gene flow. Other techniques examine the lengths of inherited DNA segments. Longer segments usually point toward more recent ancestry. Shorter fragments have often been broken apart by recombination across many generations. You remember the torn book image from earlier. Each generation tears the pages smaller. The content does not necessarily disappear immediately. It becomes harder to recognize. This allows researchers to estimate when mixing occurred. Suppose a person living 40,000 years ago carries unusually long stretches of Neanderthal ancestry. Those long fragments suggest a relatively recent Neanderthal ancestor. That is how scientists recognize that some early Homo sapiens individuals had Neanderthal relatives only a few generations back. The genome becomes genealogy. You walk through an imagined prehistoric landscape again. A cold river flows beside you. Smoke rises from a settlement on the opposite bank. You cannot see the meeting itself, but tens of thousands of years later, the descendants carry genetic evidence that the two groups did not remain separate. That is the power of population genetics. It reconstructs events without witnessing them. Researchers also look for regions where archaic ancestry is unusually common. Those regions may have been favored by natural selection. You have already seen one famous example with the Denisovan-related EPAS1 variant in Tibet. Other fragments appear connected with immune function. Still others became rare, possibly because natural selection removed them. The genome is therefore not merely a record of contact. It is a record of what happened afterward. Some ancestry survived because it helped. Some survived by chance. Some disappeared because it caused problems. You hear the faint clicking of keys. A researcher compares thousands of genomes at once. The scale matters. One person's DNA tells you very little about the full history of humanity. But when genomes from many populations are compared, recurring patterns begin to appear. Relationships emerge. Ancestry gradients appear across geography. Segments cluster. Unexpected similarities demand explanation. Sometimes the explanation is migration. Sometimes ancient interbreeding. Sometimes demographic history. And sometimes nobody is quite sure. Researchers continue debating how reliably certain statistical signals distinguish archaic admixture from deeply structured populations that remain separated for long periods. That problem has followed you from Africa. Different histories can leave similar genetic patterns. The data may be real. The interpretation remains uncertain. You should think of the genome as a damaged manuscript. Some pages survive, others are missing. Several scribes contributed. Later editors rearranged sections, and nobody included a table of contents. Scientists build models to explain the surviving pattern. They might propose that population is separated from population B at one time. Later, population C contributes ancestry. Then a bottleneck reduces genetic diversity. Afterward, another migration occurs. The model produces expected genetic patterns. Researchers compare those predictions with real genomes. If the match is poor, the history must be adjusted. This process can reveal surprising events. A population thought to be isolated may show evidence of later contact. A migration assumed to be one way may have included return movement. A supposedly simple expansion may turn into several variables. This is why ancient human migration maps keep becoming messier. The arrows multiply. You almost feel sorry for the cartographers. There is another useful clue in modern genomes. Different people carry different archaic fragments. By combining these segments across many individuals, researchers can recover portions of Neanderthal or Denisovan genetic diversity no single modern person preserves. It's like assembling a shredded document from pieces scattered among thousands of households. No one family owns the whole thing. Together they preserve more. That process has revealed how widespread archaic ancestry remains. It has also shown that percentage alone can mislead. Two people might carry similar overall amounts of Neanderthal ancestry but possess different fragments. The location of those fragments can matter more than the headline percentage. You step away from the glowing screen for a moment. Outside rain taps lightly against a window. The air smells faintly of dust-warm electronics and coffee that has now become tragically cold. The modern setting feels far removed from prehistoric caves, yet the subject is the same. Who met whom? Who moved where? Who left descendants? Human lives became data, not because those lives were unimportant, because their stories survived in one of the few forms durable enough to cross such immense stretches of time. There is something strangely moving about that. A woman living 45,000 years ago did not know her children would preserve fragments of ancestry useful to future researchers. A Denisovan father did not know his descendants might influence genomes across Asia. A Neanderthal mother did not know that scientists would one day reconstruct relationships from tiny molecular differences. They simply lived. The archive formed accidentally. Genetic history also carries one important warning. Ancestry is not identity. A percentage of Neanderthal DNA does not make one person more ancient, more primitive, or more authentic than another. All living humans are equally modern. All belong to Homo sapiens. Archaic fragments are simply pieces of population history, and those histories are shared in complicated ways. Even populations with little direct Neanderthal ancestry may carry genetic variants that move through later human migrations. Human populations have never remained perfectly sealed. The boundaries continue shifting. You return to the screen. A network of lines connects sampled populations. Some branches divide, others reconnect. The image looks almost exactly like the braided streams you imagined earlier. The metaphor was not far wrong. Human evolution is not a single road. It is traffic. Slow traffic admittedly, sometimes separated by 10,000 years, but traffic nonetheless. You watch another analysis finish. A small cluster appears where the model did not expect one. Perhaps it is noise, perhaps recent ancestry, perhaps a sign that an older population contributed genes. The uncertainty returns. This is how ghost populations are born scientifically, not from legends, from anomalies that refuse to fit the simplest model. The next question is what those inherited fragments actually did. Some changed very little. Others may have influenced survival in unfamiliar climates and against unfamiliar diseases. And a few may have helped Homo sapiens settle environments that would otherwise have been far more difficult. The living archive does not merely tell you where your ancestors went. Sometimes it tells you what helped them stay. Section 17. The glowing screen fades behind you and the genetic network becomes a landscape once again. You are back beneath an ancient sky. This time, however, you are not following one migration or one particular human group. You are following useful inheritance. Somewhere inside the bodies moving through these landscapes are fragments acquired from populations that had lived here much longer. Those fragments do not guarantee survival. Nothing in prehistory does, but in certain environments they may have offered small advantages, and small advantages repeated across generations can become enormous. You walk through a cold valley at dawn. Mist hangs above a narrow river and frost makes the grass glitter beneath pale sunlight. The air smells of wet stone smoke and animal hide. A group of Homo sapiens prepares to move. They entered this region only recently, at least by evolutionary standards. Neanderthals had occupied Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years before their arrival. That difference matters. Newcomers bring intelligence, adaptability, social networks, and technology. But they also encounter environments full of unfamiliar biological pressures. Cold, seasonality, new foods, new pathogens, different daylight patterns. The Neanderthals already possessed genetic variants shaped by many generations under those conditions. When some of that ancestry entered Homo sapiens, natural selection could preserve useful fragments. This process adaptive introgression has appeared several times during your journey. Now you look more closely at what it may have meant. One important area involves immunity. The human immune system is ancient, complicated, and occasionally a little over-enthusiastic. It must recognize dangerous organisms without attacking everything else around it. When Homo sapiens expanded into Eurasia, they encountered microorganisms their ancestors had experienced less frequently. Neanderthals had faced many of those local pathogens for much longer. Some inherited Neanderthal variants affecting immune-related genes became common in later human populations. Among these are archaic versions associated with toll-like receptors, proteins involved in recognizing components of microbes. You do not need to remember the name. Your immune cells certainly do not. They simply respond. Imagine a family arriving in a damp woodland where unfamiliar infections circulate. One person carries an inherited archaic variant that helps recognize a local pathogen more effectively. They may recover slightly faster. Perhaps their children inherit the same variant. Over many generations, small differences in survival can change how common that sequence becomes. Nobody notices evolution happening. There is no dramatic moment. A fever passes. A child survives. Life continues. That quietness is important. Most evolutionary advantages are probably not spectacular. They are tiny statistical nudges repeated through countless ordinary lives. You move through the woodland as rain begins. Drops strike broad leaves overhead. The smell of damp bark becomes stronger and cold water runs down the back of your neck. A fire waits somewhere ahead, but first you must cross a muddy slope. The environment itself reminds you that adaptation comes in layers. Clothing matters immediately. Shelter matters immediately. Fire can transform one dangerous night into a survivable one. Genes work more slowly. Cultural adaptation and genetic adaptation overlap rather than replace each other. Another set of archaic variants has been associated with skin and hair biology. Researchers have examined Neanderthal-derived sequences involved in keratin production, pigmentation and skin barrier functions. These may have interacted with colder climates, lower ultraviolet exposure and seasonal changes across Eurasia. The details remain complicated. Pigmentation is influenced by many genes. Skin biology is even more complex. A single archaic fragment does not explain why an entire population looks a particular way. Still, some inherited variants may have proved useful under conditions unfamiliar to recent migrants from lower latitudes. You pass beside a stream and wash mud from your hands. The water is painfully cold. Your fingers ache almost immediately. It is easy to understand why bodies respond strongly to climate. Yet perhaps the most famous example of adaptive archaic inheritance lies far from this valley. You have already climbed there. High on the Tibetan plateau, a Denisovan-related version of the Epus 1 region became associated with the efficient adaptation to low oxygen. That is one of the clearest cases where archaic ancestry appears to have helped later Homo sapiens thrive in an extreme environment. You remember the dry wind, the sharp sunlight, the strange sensation of breathing deeply without feeling satisfied. For people permanently living at such elevations, the difference between useful and harmful physiological responses can be substantial. A genetic fragment inherited from an archaic population became part of that solution. This raises a fascinating question. Did Homo sapiens sometimes expand more successfully because earlier human populations had already done the evolutionary experimentation? Perhaps in some cases. The wording must remain cautious. Archaic humans were not deliberately handing over survival packages. Interbreeding simply created variation. Natural selection later favored certain pieces. You might call it accidental inheritance with excellent timing. There are also examples involving metabolism. Some archaic-derived genetic regions have been associated with how the body processes fats or stores energy. Such variants could matter in environments where food changed seasonally. Winter scarcity rewards different metabolic strategies than constant abundance. Again, modern effects do not necessarily reveal ancient purpose. A variant associated today with increased disease risk may once have offered advantages under very different conditions. Evolution does not optimize for your current lifestyle. It optimizes nothing consciously. It merely preserves what works well enough under past circumstances. That can produce awkward leftovers. Some immune variants that once helped fight infection may now contribute to inflammatory responses. Other ancient adaptations may become irrelevant when diet activity and environment change. What helped your ancestors survive a cold winter is not obligated to help you survive an office chair. The genome can be rude like that. You enter a shallow shelter as evening approaches. Warmth from the fire reaches your feet. Someone nearby pounds dried plant material between stones, creating a soft rhythmic tapping. The shelter smells of smoke-damp hides and roasted roots. A child turns a carved or unusually shaped object in their hands. Perhaps it is merely a useful tool. Perhaps it carries meaning. The distinction has been lost. That small uncertainty mirrors the genetic story. Researchers can identify regions of archaic ancestry. They can sometimes show that those regions rose in frequency unusually quickly. But proving exactly why natural selection favored them can be much harder. Several possible effects may overlap. A genetic variant associated with one trait today may have influenced something different in the past. Scientists still disagree about how many supposedly beneficial archaic variants represent clear cases of adaptation rather than genetic drift or later population history. The stronger examples are persuasive. Others remain tentative. You listen to the fire crackle. Outside wind pushes gently against the shelter entrance. The scene feels secure, but only because many solutions are working together. The stone tool beside the hearth came from cultural knowledge. The hide clothing came from learned skill. The fire came from cooperation and memory. The immune system comes from millions of years of biological inheritance. And somewhere among its genes may sit a fragment acquired from a vanished human population. That is the larger lesson. Homo sapiens did not expand across the planet using only an isolated package of traits created within one lineage. Our ancestors exchanged ideas. They exchanged mates. They exchanged genes. Some of those genes became useful in environments where their original carriers had already lived for enormous spans of time. You step outside after the rain. The night air is colder, but the clouds have cleared. Stars fill the sky above the valley. Your breath becomes visible. Somewhere farther north, descendants face long winters. Farther east, others encounter new pathogens. High in Asia, communities adapt to oxygen-poor air. Across each landscape, tiny pieces of archaic ancestry may offer slight advantages. But inheritance is never purely generous. The same ancient fragments that once helped under prehistoric conditions can behave very differently thousands of generations later. Survival leaves gifts. Sometimes it also leaves complications, and that is where the next trail leads. Section 8. The stars above the cold valley remain bright, but the meaning of ancient inheritance begins to shift. Until now, many archaic genes have sounded like useful gifts. Some may have strengthened immune responses. Others helped people tolerate unfamiliar climates, changing daylight, or thin mountain air. But evolution never signs a permanent guarantee. A genetic advantage belongs to a particular environment, a particular time, and a particular collection of pressures. Change the environment and the same inheritance may behave differently. You leave the shelter and enter a modern-looking landscape only gradually. The prehistoric forest thin. The smell of wood smoke fades. Stone paths become roads while fires become lamps glowing behind walls. Yet the ancient fragments remain inside the bodies walking past you. They have crossed every transition. Agriculture, cities, industrial life, electric light, processed food, antibiotics, central heating. The genes remained old while the environment transformed around them. This creates what evolutionary biologists sometimes describe as mismatch. A trait shaped under past conditions may no longer fit present circumstances particularly well. Imagine an immune system inherited from ancestors who faced frequent infections, wounds, parasites, and unfamiliar microorganisms. A strong inflammatory response could be valuable. React quickly, contain the threat, survive. But modern life can expose that same immune machinery to very different conditions. Some archaic derived variants associated with stronger immune responses have also been linked with increased susceptibility to inflammatory or autoimmune disorders. That does not mean Neanderthal DNA simply causes disease. The relationship is far more complicated. Thousands of genes interact. Diet matters. Age matters. Microbial exposure matters. Lifestyle matters. Chance matters too. Still, the trade-off is fascinating. The same biological vigilance that once helped defend against infection may become troublesome when the immune system responds too aggressively. You imagine a prehistoric child recovering from illness beside a smoky fire. Outside, cold rain taps against hides stretched over a shelter entrance. The air smells of wet soil, fat, and bitter herbs crushed between stones. That child's immune response needs to be fast. There are no antibiotics waiting nearby. There is no laboratory. Survival depends largely upon biology, care, nutrition, and fortune. Now move forward thousands of generations. The inherited machinery remains. The threats have changed. The ancient solution may no longer fit as neatly. Metabolism tells a similar story. Some archaic variants have been studied for possible links with fat storage, blood sugar regulation, and energy use. In a world of seasonal scarcity, efficient energy storage could become valuable. Food arrives unpredictably. Winter reduces options. A successful hunt may be followed by days of limited calories. Bodies capable of storing energy efficiently gain insurance against uncertainty. Modern food environments can reverse that pressure. Constant access to calorie-dense meals changes the equation. A biological tendency once useful during scarcity may contribute differently when scarcity disappears. Again, no single ancient variant determines anyone's health. Human metabolism is extraordinarily complex. But evolutionary mismatch offers one possible framework for understanding why yesterday's advantage can become today's inconvenience. You hear a refrigerator humming instead of wind. Quite an evolutionary plot twist. The ancient genome survived the Ice Age only to encounter midnight snacks. Sleep provides another curious example. Some Neanderthal-derived variants have been associated with circadian rhythms and chronotype, including tendencies toward earlier or later activity. Researchers have suggested that archaic humans living at higher latitudes may have adapted to strong seasonal changes in daylight. Those inherited differences could influence modern sleep timing. But modern light has rewritten the night. Screens glow long after sunset. Streetlights erase darkness. Work schedules ignore sunrise. A biological rhythm shaped beneath natural skies now operates inside an environment no ancient human encountered. That does not make archaic ancestry harmful. It makes interpretation difficult. A variant influencing sleep timing might once have interacted beneficially with seasonal daylight. Today, it could interact with artificial schedules in completely different ways. Researchers continue debating how confidently modern associations can reveal the original evolutionary role of particular Neanderthal-derived variants. A gene linked with one trait today may have been favored for another reason entirely. Genes often influence several biological processes. Selection can act on one effect while carrying another along. You return briefly to the prehistoric valley. Morning mist gathers above the grass. Someone steps outside the shelter and stretches stiff shoulders beneath the weak sun. Their body contains no concept of disease risk statistics. It simply responds to the world around it. That world shapes which genetic combinations continue. One widely discussed modern example involves archaic ancestry and responses to viral infections. Neanderthal-derived genetic regions have been associated with stronger or weaker outcomes during particular respiratory infections. Some inherited variants appear protective. Others have been associated with elevated risk. The details depend upon the genetic region and disease. Ancient ancestry can therefore point in opposite directions. There is no single Neanderthal effect. That is worth remembering. Popular descriptions sometimes treat archaic DNA as though it were one coherent package containing personality traits, immune strength, pain tolerance, and perhaps an inexplicable fondness for caves. Genomes do not work like that. Each inherited fragment has its own history. Some do nothing noticeable. Some interact with many other genes. Some vary in effect between environments. Others disappeared entirely because natural selection removed them. The quirky part is that modern researchers can sometimes identify regions where Neanderthal ancestry is unusual. These genetic deserts suggest that certain archaic sequences were strongly selected against after interbreeding. The emptiness becomes evidence. You do not see what survived. You notice what vanished. Particularly low levels of archaic ancestry in some genomic regions may indicate incompatibilities affecting fertility or development. Scientists have explored whether male hybrids experienced reduced fertility in some ancient crosses. This remains an area of active research. The genetic pattern is suggestive, but reconstructing reproductive biology from distant ancestry requires caution. You feel another reminder of how incomplete the archive remains. Genes can show that something was removed. They may not tell you exactly why. The same uncertainty surrounds many modern health associations. Large genetic studies can identify correlations between archaic variants and particular traits. But correlation is not destiny. A person carrying one archaic-derived sequence is not condemned to experience its statistically associated outcome. Individual biology is far more complicated. Environment can strengthen or weaken genetic effects. Thousands of other variants matter simultaneously. This is especially important because the language of ancient DNA can easily become misleading. Terms like Neanderthal gene sound dramatic. In reality, many sequences inherited from Neanderthals differ only slightly from related human versions. Some were present in common ancestors before populations separated. Others entered through later interbreeding. Scientists must distinguish between those histories carefully. The genome is not divided cleanly into modern and archaic compartments. It is layered. You walk again beneath evening skies. This time the landscape seems neither ancient nor modern. It feels suspended between both. The smell of smoke returns faintly. Cool air touches your hands. Nearby water moves over stones with a quiet, repetitive sound. You think about the word burden. It may be too harsh. These ancient variants were not mistakes. They survived because circumstances allowed them to survive. Some were useful, some neutral, some harmful enough to disappear. Others remained because their disadvantages were small or appeared only under conditions that came much later. Evolution does not know the future. It cannot prepare a Pleistocene hunter for office lighting, processed sugar, air conditioning, or modern pathogens. It only filters what happens now. That makes your genome less like an instruction manual and more like a travel bag packed by thousands of generations. Some items remain essential. Some became outdated. Others are useful only under very particular conditions. And a few are there because nobody ever had enough reason to remove them. You carry them all. The wind softens as darkness settles. The inherited gifts and burdens become difficult to separate. What matters is context. A strong immune response can protect and inflame. Efficient energy storage can sustain and complicate. A circadian tendency can suit one latitude and frustrate another lifestyle. Ancient ancestry is neither blessing nor curse. It is history still functioning. And to understand why so much of that history survived, you must finally ask what happened to the populations themselves. Neanderthals disappeared. Denisovans disappeared. Other ghosts vanish so completely that only genetic shadows remain. But disappearance does not always mean destruction. Sometimes one population continues quietly inside another. Section 19. You remain beneath the quiet evening sky thinking about that last possibility. Sometimes a population disappears without every individual lineage ending. That distinction becomes especially important now. For decades, the disappearance of Neanderthals was often told as a simple replacement story. Modern humans arrived. Neanderthals vanished. One population succeeded while another failed. It was clean, dramatic, and satisfyingly uncomplicated. Prehistory rarely offers such kindness. You walk into Europe roughly 40,000 years ago and the landscape is changing quickly. Cold winds move across open grasslands. Dark pine forests gather along protected valleys, while snow remains on distant ridges even after sunlight reaches the lower ground. The air smells of wet vegetation, wood smoke, and animal hide. Several kinds of humans have recently occupied these regions. Now the balance is shifting. Neanderthals are becoming harder to find. Their archaeological traces decline across much of Europe. Homo sapiens communities become increasingly widespread. By around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappear from the recognizable fossil and archaeological record as a distinct population. That is the mainstream fact. The difficult question is why. You follow a narrow river through a cold valley. On one bank, a small Neanderthal group occupies a familiar shelter. They know the surrounding hills intimately. They know where animals cross in autumn. They recognize which slopes collect edible plants after snow melts. Their knowledge has been built across generations, but the group is small. That makes everything fragile. Genetic evidence suggests some late Neanderthal populations had low genetic diversity and relatively small effective population sizes. A few difficult seasons can therefore matter enormously. One injured hunter means fewer people gathering food. One failed birth matters more. A winter that would inconvenience a large population can reshape a tiny community. The quiet mathematics of population size begins working against them. You hear wind pressing against the cave entrance. Inside, someone feeds thin branches into a small fire. Smoke catches in the throat. A sleeping child shifts beneath an animal hide. There may be fewer relatives than there were when the child's grandparents were young. No one needs to understand demography to experience its consequences. Then another population enters nearby territory. Homo sapiens communities may have maintained wider social networks in some regions. Raw materials sometimes traveled impressive distances. Objects moved. People moved. Information moved. That broader connectivity may have helped communities survive local shortages. If one valley failed, relatives elsewhere could matter. Neanderthals also maintained social connections, so the contrast should not be exaggerated. But even modest differences could become important over thousands of years. Competition is therefore one possible ingredient. Both populations needed food. Both sought good shelters. Both followed similar animals through overlapping landscapes. You do not need battles everywhere for competition to matter. A group arriving first at a seasonal hunting location may simply leave less behind. A preferred cave may already be occupied. A reliable stone source may become harder to access. Pressure can accumulate quietly. There is no grand confrontation, only fewer options. Climate adds another complication. The periods surrounding the final millennia of Neanderthal survival included rapid environmental fluctuations. Temperatures changed, vegetation shifted. Animal communities reorganized. Habitats familiar for generations could become less dependable. Neanderthals had survived many earlier climate swings, which makes climate alone an incomplete explanation. Still, the final changes occurred while their populations were already fragmented in several regions. Timing matters. A challenge becomes more dangerous when another challenge arrives beside it. You cross a ridge where the forest suddenly opens into windswept grassland. The smell changes from damp bark to dry soil. Animal tracks lead farther east than before. People must follow. Mobility increases. Children travel longer distances. Older members may struggle. A population does not need one catastrophic event to decline. It can shrink through many small disadvantages. Researchers still disagree about how much weight should be given to climate, competition, disease, demographic weakness, and assimilation when explaining the Neanderthal disappearance. Most likely no single cause ruled everywhere. Different regions may have followed different paths. That possibility feels less cinematic. It is probably more realistic. Then there is disease. When previously separated human populations meet, pathogens can travel with them. Homo sapiens entering Eurasia may have carried microorganisms unfamiliar to Neanderthals. Neanderthals may have carried pathogens unfamiliar to Homo sapiens. Could disease have contributed to population decline? Possibly. The idea remains difficult to test directly. Ancient pathogens rarely leave convenient explanations beside skeletons. Disease therefore remains plausible without becoming a complete answer. You pause near another camp. Two groups have occupied this valley at different times. Their hearths lie close together in the archaeological layers. One belongs to Neanderthals. Another appears later and is associated with Homo sapiens. The distance in time between them may be centuries. To your imagination, they seem almost neighbors. Archaeology compresses time strangely. 500 years can become a few centimeters of soil. One quirky debate involves the final dates themselves. Certain sites once presented as unusually late Neanderthal refuges have been redated or disputed as dating methods improved. A cave can hold on to a dramatic extinction story for years, then lose it after one laboratory result. The dead remain patient. Researchers are the ones revising the labels. This matters because identifying the final surviving Neanderthal community is incredibly difficult. Radiocarbon dating near its practical limits carries substantial uncertainty. Contamination can make samples appear younger. Stratigraphic disturbance can mix artifacts from separate occupations. The last Neanderthal may therefore remain scientifically invisible, but disappearance contains another possibility. Absorption. You have already seen that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Their descendants survived. So when Neanderthals disappear as a distinct population, some of them do not vanish biologically. They become ancestors of expanding Homo sapiens communities. Imagine two small populations meeting repeatedly across generations. At first they remain recognizable. Then some individuals join neighboring groups. Children carry mixed ancestry. Later generations carry less of one ancestral component after repeated mating within the larger population. Eventually the smaller group no longer exists separately. Nothing dramatic happens on the final evening. No one knows they are the last. Identity simply dissolves into dissonance. Genetic evidence supports at least some degree of this process. Living populations outside Africa retain Neanderthal ancestry. That alone proves total biological replacement did not occur. However, absorption cannot explain everything. The surviving proportion of Neanderthal ancestry is limited. Much of their genetic variation disappeared. Natural selection removed some inherited sequences while demographic expansion diluted others. Their populations still ceased to exist as distinct communities. Their languages vanished. Their social traditions disappeared. Their remembered places lost their meanings. Survival inside another population is real but incomplete. The same mystery surrounds Denisovans. Their disappearance is even harder to reconstruct because their fossil record remains sparse. Different Denisovan-related populations may have survived in various parts of Asia at different times. Some interbred with Homo sapiens. Others may have disappeared without known descendants. You cannot identify one final Denisovan camp and watch its fire go out. The map is too incomplete. That uncertainty may apply even more strongly to unnamed ghost populations. Some could have been absorbed. Some may have died out. Some might have contributed ancestry to other archaic groups before Homo sapiens ever met them. Their disappearance becomes a chain of partial survivals. One lineage carries another. Then that lineage enters another. History travels inside history. You sit beside a small fire as night settles over the valley. The smell of smoke is soft now. A heat beneath your hand feels worn smooth at the edges. Someone nearby quietly repairs a broken tool. No one is discussing extinction. They are thinking about tomorrow. Food, weather, children, the route to the next shelter. That may be the most important correction to the old story. Neanderthals did not spend their final centuries knowing they were doomed. Denisovans did not understand themselves as evolutionary ghosts. They experienced ordinary days until ordinary days stopped continuing for their communities. Population decline looks dramatic from a distance. From inside it, the process may feel almost invisible. One family moves away. Another has fewer children. A neighboring group does not return. A familiar shelter stays empty. Then generations later, the landscape belongs mostly to someone else. You watch the flames lower. Soon only red embers remain. The people around you fade into darkness, but their ancestry does not disappear with them. Fragments move forward through children migrations and countless unknown families. That inheritance eventually reaches the present, and in the final stretch of your journey you will return to your own body, not as a pure endpoint of evolution, not as the triumphant survivor of a simple contest, but as a living archive assembled from meetings, disappearances, inheritances, and people whose names the world forgot. Section 20. The last embers in the ancient valley slowly disappear, and with them the familiar outlines of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and unnamed populations fade. For a moment there is only darkness. Then you hear something remarkably ordinary. Your own breathing. The cold prehistoric wind becomes the softer air of the room around you. The smell of smoke fades, replaced by familiar fabric, quiet walls, and the still atmosphere of a late evening. You have returned to the present, but you have not returned alone. The journey through deep human history has followed you home because pieces of that vanished world remain inside living people. Not as memories, not as voices, not as hidden prehistoric personalities waiting to emerge whenever someone forgets where they left their keys. They survive as inheritance. Tiny fragments of DNA have traveled through tens of thousands of generations, copied again and again inside bodies whose names vanished almost immediately after death. Some fragments came from Neanderthals. Some came from Denisovan-related populations. Others may eventually be traced to human groups that science has not clearly identified. The result is written quietly inside humanity. You imagine looking at your own hand. The skin seems ordinary beneath the soft light. Lines cross the palm. Fingernails catch a faint reflection. Nothing visibly announces the ancient populations whose genes may contribute to the wider human story. Yet every cell containing a nucleus carries a genome shaped by an extraordinary history. Your ancestry does not travel backward along one road. It branches. Then those branches divide again. Eventually millions of individual lives appear behind you. Go back only a few thousand years and the number of genealogical connections becomes enormous. Go farther and populations repeatedly overlap. The idea of perfectly separate ancestral lines begins to collapse. You are less like the end of one chain. You are more like a knot in an immense net. That net once stretched through African grasslands, Mediterranean woodlands, Siberian caves, Asian mountains, tropical forests and coastlines now buried beneath the sea. People moved through all of them. They met strangers. They exchanged knowledge. Sometimes they competed. Sometimes they avoided each other. And sometimes they had children. That simple fact transformed the human family. One mainstream genetic discovery made the transformation impossible to ignore. Many living populations outside Africa carry roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal-derived ancestry in individual genomes. Some populations in Asia and Oceania also carry Denisovan-derived ancestry, with particularly substantial levels among several populations connected to New Guinea and surrounding regions. Those percentages sound modest, but remember what you discovered earlier. Different people preserve different fragments. Humanity collectively carries much more archaic genetic material than any single individual does. The vanished population survives like a scattered manuscript. One family carries one page. Another family carries another. Nobody owns the complete volume, but the text has not disappeared. You move once more through an imagined library. There are no shelves. Instead, chromosomes stretch through darkness like long ribbons. Small regions glow briefly as you pass. One may contain ancestry connected with immune responses. Another belongs to an inherited pattern affecting skin biology. Farther along sits a fragment related to physiological adaptation in thin mountain air. Many others probably do nothing dramatic at all. They simply remain because inheritance allowed them to remain. That ordinariness is strangely beautiful. Not every surviving ancient gene needs a heroic purpose. Some survive because nobody removed them. Evolution contains plenty of accidents. For every famous adaptation discussed in documentaries, countless genetic fragments drift quietly through generations without attracting attention. You might call them molecular hitchhikers. They have been travelling for 40,000 years and still have not offered to pay for fuel. Yet even the useful fragments resist simple storytelling. A variant that helped one population under prehistoric conditions may behave differently today. An immune response useful against ancient pathogens can interact unpredictably with modern environments. A metabolic tendency shaped during scarcity may function differently under constant abundance. Evolution does not design for eternity. It works with the present and leaves the future to deal with the paperwork. You continue deeper into this living archive. Some pages are missing. Large portions of Neanderthal genetic diversity disappeared when their populations vanished. Many Denisovan lineages may have left little or no ancestry in living humans. Unknown populations could have vanished completely. Their genes may be gone. Their tools may have decayed. Their camps may lie beneath rivers, deserts, glaciers, cities or oceans. Human history contains more silence than evidence. That should make you cautious. Researchers continue debating how many ghost populations can truly be inferred from modern DNA, especially within Africa and parts of Asia. Some unusual genetic patterns may represent admixture with unknown archaic humans. Others may result from very old structure among Homo sapiens populations themselves. Future discoveries may settle certain arguments. Others may become even more complicated. That has happened repeatedly already. Every time the human family tree begins looking tidy, another fossil genome, tooth protein, or handful of cave dirt appears and quietly ruins the diagram. There is something comforting about that. Humanity refuses simplicity. You remember Denisova Cave. A tiny finger fragment revealed a population nobody knew existed. Then another small bone revealed a girl with a Neanderthal mother and Denisovan father. The discoveries would have sounded almost fantastical before ancient DNA analysis became possible. Now they are part of a mainstream human evolutionary science. So imagine what may still be waiting. A tooth sits unnoticed inside a museum drawer. A cave layer remains unexcavated. Sediment beneath a mountain shelter contains molecules from an unknown population. A fossil currently carrying one label may eventually receive another. Science has not finished meeting your relatives. One particularly curious possibility is that entire human populations may be known genetically before scientists ever identify their bodies with confidence. The Denisovans already demonstrated this. Future ghost populations might follow the same path. First comes mathematics, then perhaps a jaw, then a tooth, eventually maybe a face. You walk outside beneath the night sky. The air is cool against your skin. Leaves move somewhere nearby, producing a gentle dry whisper. A faint earthy smell rises after the evening humidity settles. Above you are stars that prehistoric humans also watched. The constellations have shifted slightly across immense spans of time, yet the experience remains familiar. Someone 40,000 years ago probably looked upward after everyone else fell asleep. Perhaps that person wondered about the lights. Perhaps they simply enjoyed the quiet. You will never know. But that person belonged to a human world much more crowded than yours. Several human populations once shared Earth. Homo sapiens survived. Neanderthals did not remain distinct. Denisovans disappeared as recognizable populations. Other branches vanished before you learned their names. It would be easy to turn this survival into a victory story. You resisted that temptation. Homo sapiens may have possessed demographic, technological, cultural, or social advantages in particular circumstances. Climate probably mattered. Population size mattered. Interbreeding mattered. Luck mattered. There was no single evening when humanity became yours alone. The process unfolded gradually. A Neanderthal community disappeared from one valley. A Homo sapiens group expanded elsewhere. Two populations met. Children were born. Some ancestry continued. Eventually only one recognizable human species remained. But that species was already mixed. This is why the ghost humans are not truly standing outside your family. They are woven into it. The boundaries that appear so clear in museum displays become softer once you follow ancestry. Modern humans are not Neanderthals. Modern humans are not Denisovans. Those were distinct populations with their own evolutionary histories. Yet neither were they completely disconnected from us. The relationship lies somewhere more interesting. They were cousins, neighbors, occasional partners, sometimes ancestors. The words overlap because reality did. You think again about Denisova 11. One teenage girl quietly destroys the fantasy of perfectly separated ancient humanities. Her existence turns arrows on evolutionary diagrams into a family, a mother, a father, a daughter. No model can make that impersonal again. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson hidden inside your DNA. Human history has always been made from encounters. Some were distant, some hostile, some cooperative, some intimate. You inherit the results without inheriting the stories. The stories disappeared. The inheritance stayed. And now the journey becomes quieter. You no longer need to search the caves. You no longer need to climb the plateau or cross the ancient shoreline. Allow those landscapes to drift away. Let the Siberian mountains soften beneath snowfall. Let the Tibetan wind settle across empty grass. Let warm rain fall through the forests of ancient Africa. Farther west, a Neanderthal fire burns gently inside a limestone shelter. Someone adds one final branch. The flame brightens, then relaxes. Nearby, a child sleeps beneath a heavy hide while adults speak in voices you will never hear. Across another enormous distance, Denisovan families settle into their own evening. The smoke rises. Tools are put aside. Footsteps become fewer. No one knows that their population will someday disappear. No one needs to know. It is enough. Thousands of generations pass softly now. One child becomes an ancestor. Families divide and reconnect. Fragments of DNA move silently through bodies, crossing valleys, mountains, coastlines, and centuries. Nothing hurries. Eventually, one tiny inherited sequence reaches another child. Then another. Then another. The ancient world grows distant but never entirely leaves. And here you are, breathing quietly in the present. You do not need to understand every branch of that enormous family tree tonight. You do not need to solve the identity of every ghost population. Scientists themselves are still working on that. For now, it is enough to know that humanity carries its past more deeply than any written history could manage. You are surrounded by silence, yet that silence is full of journeys, full of vanished fires, full of people who lived ordinary nights beneath unfamiliar stars. Their names are gone. Their faces are mostly gone. Their languages vanished without a single recorded word. But some small part of their existence travelled onward. Through chance, through survival, through families, through you and through humanity around you. The ancient fires grow dim now. The wind becomes softer. The cave entrances disappear into darkness. And And somewhere beyond the last edge of memory, the ghost humans finally become quiet again. Not lost, just resting inside the long peaceful story of who we became.